I'm not ready.
We're going to get
We're
started.
live, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. We're going to continue our reading of the fourth chapter of Black Reconstruction, the the general strike, excuse me. And but before we do that, we're going to have a report on where we are in the. We're calling it a symposium on Black Reconstruction. So we met on Thursday. We've been meeting a lot these days, but I'll ask Serafina and Emily if they'll give us an update, the date, the agreed upon date, the agreed upon title, and what the architecture of the event looks like. So start. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, in celebration of Du Bois's birthday on February 25th.
Oh, okay.
We're gonna have I guess it's symposia on the Du Bois's Black Reconstruction as we've been reading it in preschool. And the title that we are working out or have worked out now is The Black Proletariat and the Fourth American Revolution, the Makings of a New People.
Why don't you just state it again? And see if everybody feels comfortable with that title.
Yeah.
Just state it again because it is a bit complicated.
You can explain more to it.
Go ahead. Sorry.
If you want to explain more.
Yeah, we'll just state the title again. Maybe I'll say something about the process we went through to come to this.
The Black Proletariat and the Fourth American Revolution, the Makings of a New People.
Yeah, that's. But we'll come back to. Well, let's just on the title. How? What do y'all think of that title?
Yeah, I like it.
It feels forward looking.
Yeah. And what our process of arriving at that, because it was Emily, Serafina, and myself meeting,
Sunday.
on Sundays, and then on Thursday, Jeremiah and Kathy. Alice and joined it. Yeah. And what we're trying to do, as you say, forward looking, is to amplify some of the thinking from the 10th anniversary. And you're absolutely right, Blake. That's what we were trying to achieve, that forward lookingness. And we'll come back to that, and that relates to something that Michelle and I were talking about sociology. But we'll come back to that.
Yeah. She looks nice today.
Can I get a pound? No.
But anyway.
Okay, good. I'm sorry. I interrupted Serafina.
That's okay. Because I guess we were talking about why we're celebrating Du Bois's birthday in this way, in I guess overall anchoring the Black Reconstruction. And also a thing that we've been talking about is Black Reconstruction as a philosophical work, a work of philosophy. But we're talking about the recovery of the Black Reconstruction in a new way, in a new time.
Could you just repeat that? The recovery
Yeah.
of Black Reconstruction in a new way, in a new time. Very important. I think that'll be the centerpiece of the call to the symposium. But go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you didn't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But
There has to be laughter.
There's only one person left.
Joey. All right.
Some days later.
Good day. So for the program itself, we're kind of talking about having two panels and a roundtable. And for the first panel, if you don't mind me saying,
I'm sorry.
like we were thinking about talking about the democratic struggle being the foremost
Yes.
theme, and then the second panel will be on a new theoretical synthesis. Our roundtable will be dealing with practical questions and the ideological obstacles to these practical questions of like what's happening right now, the current things, and we're talking about involving different organizations that we've been dealing with, like Platypus, Midwestern Marks,
Church of the
and Church
Overcomer.
of the Overcomer. But when we were working out the first panel for the democratic struggle, I guess that's more of a more fleshed out. But we're talking about like being more exact on what we mean by democracy and what's a new democracy, and defining what is the democratic struggle for this time in America. We're talking about how the capacity of the American people cannot be separated from the democratic struggles, including white people. So the question of capacity, and we can look at, we've been studying that with Black Reconstruction. Hey man, I thought you were in Hawaii.
Going to Mars.
Oh. Wow.
Yeah, cool. You're so funny, Doc. Okay, but
Okay, good. I'm sorry.
no, you
Forgive
did.
me for interrupting.
No, you didn't.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, this is the thing about capacity. It just made me think about in Black Reconstruction. Well, why it does Du Bois write the text Black Reconstruction, and what purpose does it serve? Not only like a question of history, but the potential of the revolutionary process being continued. Yeah, but yeah. And we're also going to be debating these questions about what is fascism, you know, and the, I guess, counter-revolutionary politics, or theses of Gerald Horne, and so on. So that's what we've been discussing so far, I guess.
Go ahead.
You can say more.
Yeah, I think we talked about the panels having those specific themes because in terms of democratic struggle, a big reason why we wanted to focus on that is because oftentimes I think today you hear people talking about how we need to build socialism. But I think that's different than what even Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction. The way Du Bois is laying out, formulating the American revolutionary process in its essence, and the form it'll take. Like rather than focusing on, because even Henry Winston talks about the stages of American Revolution and all that has been won in 1776, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and today, like talking about how each stage has had a democratic demand as a part of the ultimate, you know, these democratic struggles all in the name of a new democracy. And so I think the first panel is not just grappling with those questions and us like asserting what we mean by a new democracy, especially for now, like Serafina was saying, but I also think it's a time for us. I think the big thing that it seems like people get confused by is us asserting that the civil rights movement is a revolution. And even when I was talking on the phone with my dad, because I was feeling anxious about all that we're doing in free school, I think, I just think even the questions that we're asking with Black Reconstruction and in some ways, like the theorizing we're doing, it made me really anxious. And I called my dad, and my dad was like, you need to, he's like, everything you said sounds right, but what you need to do is you need to define revolution. Like, he's like, most people, when you say revolution, they mean like the seizure of state power. And he's like,
The overturning of the state.
Yes, the overturning of the state, or like, yeah. So I feel like this panel, like, it's really cool being able to just nail down saying that we're talking about democratic struggles, what we mean by that, and then even to assert the civil rights movement as a revolution, as a democratic struggle, and yeah, be able to assert that I think is significant. And then, of course, the second panel, a new theoretical synthesis, us like getting deeper into what Free School has already talked about in terms of Lenin and Du Bois, why like Leninism alone cannot explain both the past of the American Revolutionary past, but also the American Revolutionary possibilities are now, like, and why Du Bois is important. I think us actually being able to like do the work of explaining that will be important. And yeah, and that's just 2 panels. Like we're not even talking about the round table. So I feel like that's a lot of. It's exciting, but it's also like it's a lot of theoretical work. I think. Yeah.
No, but that's the thing that also came up in the meeting, which was interesting. I asked Emily about it later, but like people got nervous, and I was like, it's
okay. Don't worry.
no. That's not exactly what I wanted to highlight, because I had asked Emily about it after, and I was like, well, what is it coming from exactly? I remember when we were reflecting from the 10th anniversary, and Caleb was talking about how some people were responding to the event and how like they're emotionally touched, and I was like, oh shit! Like for the first time, I was taken aback and actually had to think about what we just did, because I'm not really. I initially don't see the entirety sometimes of what we're doing, because I'm really just focused on what the event is, and as in like, because I'm more concerned about thinking about developing the right thing or trying to see what we come to. And I know that what we do is like what we do in the theoretical heavy lifting, in the events, in the conferences and festivals now, is important, and it will. And even if it is new, I don't really see the risk in that until maybe after the fact, because then I can see that we did break boundaries that and different emotional walls that people have, even like this thing about North and South Korea and the question of communism. That's a big deal, and it has historical trauma. Like people have been relating to these questions in a lot of ways for a long period of time, and I think that's also something that makes me reflect as we're going forward, that when we are developing these things and we have been meeting so long as we do, that it is uncharted waters in some ways, especially in the fact of like the new theoretical syntheses and things. Like, because Emily also mentioned to me that we're kind of advancing where even Du Bois and Lenin were, because we're in our time and they're not alive right now. You know what I mean? So it's not like they can do what they did when they were alive, but we have the tools that they did leave. So I think that there is a certain there's a certain like awesome responsibility that comes with it, and I'm more reflecting or wanting to emphasize on the fact that like we as the Free School are a part of something that is important, and that we are taking risk, but that risk is also important for us to be able to move forward and to help humanity also move forward, which I think is more important than maybe the risk. But I just wanted to say that, because I know it could be no, wait. No, I know.
Okay.
Because I'm always there,
Oh, good.
just to be honest. But I just wanted to mention it before, people start getting actually really anxious and like bustling with like different little things that we need to do to make the thing go. I just want to tell us that we're doing a good job already, and just to say, as we're moving forward, I think we're on the right track. So
Yeah, I in our meetings, especially on Thursday, I expressed a similar feeling. I was feeling a bit overwhelmed with the very thing that Blaze is talking about, and what Sarah is saying, because we are, I guess I would say, in our own little way, maybe it's not so little, because Emily said that her father said, "You're asking large questions." And his idea was that you should break the large questions down into their parts and be more clear about, what you're talking about, something like that. And I thought a lot about what you told me about what he said, and then I said, and Danny, you'll understand this completely, that it is a dialectic between the wholes and the parts. That you cannot clarify the parts like what is revolution
Yeah.
without an overall view of what democracy is, what the people are doing, etc. And I felt, and I still feel, especially, actually, I think for myself, I feel, okay, you could call it anxiety, you could call it the pressure of the moment, and you're right about this, Sarah. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves
Yeah, and then,
because of the feeling of the need to get it right and the sense that we are close to getting it right. I mean, I feel that way myself, but I just, so I was feeling the way she was feeling, and I still do. And I think part of it, you all should know, is in our, going back and forth to even put a title on this. And Blaise, you're absolutely right. A title that speaks both to the now of the US people, and I want to come to that, the question of a people, but also the future. It's kind of like King's thing, tomorrow is today. But so it's been an intellectual kind of thing. And obviously we want to do, when we're planning, it's always, we want to do the best for the free school. We want to represent the free school as best we can, etc. But just on the question of democracy and what you were saying, Serafina, Michelle and I were just speaking to each other this morning, and she asked me, what is aristocracy? How would I define aristocracy? And I said that aristocracy is the oldest and most ancient form, even though it continues to exist in symbolic ways today, form of state power and state organization. Now, without going into a lot of talk about that, and I think this is in Black Reconstruction, I think it's in a lot of what Du Bois writes, there is no aristocratic tradition significantly in the United States. We don't have a history of czars, of kings, of queens, of whatever. The closest was an imitation of European aristocracy in the slave owners, the slaveocracy. What does a democratic struggle look like, not based upon the form that it had to take in Europe, the church, and then the landowners and aristocracy? You see what I'm saying? So if you say religion is the opiate of the people, well, pretty much, if you have this powerful church that is a part of the aristocratic state. But suppose you don't have that. Religion can be both. And we see in the Black experience, it also serves a liberatory function. But my point, I'm just as apropos what Michelle and I were talking about, what does the democratic struggle look like where people have already won?
Yes.
Maybe on paper, but they have won democratic rights. That the state itself on paper, often violated, has to be governed by law, not by what a king who is anointed by the church says is right or wrong. Does that make sense? So this gets us to the question of the American people. And I think our one of the assumptions that we proceed from is that we can speak of such a thing as an American people. We're all not the same. Of course, the Black people are, like Du Bois said, a nation within a nation, unique characteristics and so on. But nonetheless, in a large sense, view themselves as part of a people. You know what I'm saying? And king, we're all wrapped in a single garment of destiny. What is he saying? The American people. You know what I'm saying? This is why you get people who are rooted in neo-Garveyism, Marcus Garveyism, and will append to that Malcolm X and a form of separatism, that there's not an American people. There's never been an American people. There's a white people and a Black people, and the Black people are legally inferior. And now that you can't, that's true. You have to account for that. But you account for it by acknowledging something revolutionary happening in the 50s and 60s. And that's why I think, in a legitimate sense, that King's vision authorizes him, at least in our eyes, and it can be argued for, as the foundational figure of a new American people. Without King, it doesn't quite make it across the finish line, if you dig what I'm saying. With King, we make it across the finish line. And with King, we see each other differently. You know, with that language, because then we see the potential. And that's so much King, the potential of this people. And the assumption that King is making is that the American Revolution forever ended aristocracy and freed the people to struggle for democracy. And these 200, 400, how many years you want to put it, has been this struggle for democracy. I mean, when you dig it, it's a beautiful thing. But then, like Sarah said, what is the struggle for democracy now going forward? Given, and this is what we're also saying, a nation which has a revolutionary history. People say revolution means that you've been successful. No. Sometimes revolutions advance incremental change, quantitative change. And see, this is what I guess we were, you know, Emily and Sarah and I were just debating, not debating, but discussing. Is it always all or nothing? Revolution or nothing? You see what I'm saying? No, it's not that. And that's why I think you mentioned Winston's concept of stages. And stages based upon what the capacity of the people are. Of course, I think, and I've discussed this with Danny, I think, and I think we would have a consensus around this, that the capacity of the American people as a people, not just Black folk, but as a people, might be higher today than it's ever been. That's we're trying to link the mark. We'll work it out more. And of course, in the symposium, it'll be worked out. It'll be a question of further developing, debating, and so on and so forth. Just on the synthesis thing, and again, Lenin had to think of democracy in contradiction to aristocracy,
Right.
the czar. And they always said, and his government. They didn't say the government, just like in England, you wouldn't say the king and his government, although they symbolically try to act that way. No, it's the British government. But in Russia, it was the czar's government. The government ruled because of the authority of the czar. We don't think that way. The American people don't think that way. We do not have that history. So when we think of the democratic struggle, we're thinking of a different history, and so on. So I think the synthesis, and of course, I often think of State and Revolution as not just a further elaborating of Engels and Marx, but Engels, the origin, the origin of the private. What's the title?
Family, private property, and state.
Yeah, right. One of my favorite books of all times. But he is also saying, what is the objective of the democratic struggle? And he has to think not, going forward from John Locke or even Rousseau, but he's thinking in some ways against them. It is, I could see an argument that State and Revolution is a debate with Locke and the tradition of bourgeois liberalism.
Right.
So yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Can I just make one last point? And the other thing is the involvement of many other organizations. Danny, we want you. Of course, Rosa, Wentai, and the woman who
Aaron.
is the president.
Aaron?
Who?
Yeah.
Who?
Aaron.
Who?
Aaron.
Aaron.
I've messaged people. I messaged
Oh,
Rosa
yeah.
and went to
And we would like you and Aaron to
Okay.
be speakers.
I'll message Aaron then.
Yeah. And then, of course, Midwest Marxist, which we're going to do a Zoom, getting to know each other with them next week.
Yeah.
And also Stan Willis, the gentleman that was here last time. And of course, we'll see, but to make it a bigger discussion. And of course, the round table, we haven't fully worked that out yet because how does is the round table repeating what the previous panels did? Or, I think the way you put it, Sarah, the working out of the practical tasks, the practical ideological problems. For example, how does Eric Foner's work Reconstruction relate to Du Bois's Black Reconstruction? And if, this is a big question, by the way, does Eric Foner's work supersede and make, make Black Reconstruction obsolete? Obsolete. That's a lot of people think it does. It's a large, impressive volume that is repeatedly reprinted, since 1987, 85, when I think it was published somewhere around the 50th anniversary of Black Reconstruction. And I don't think that was just coincidental, because it is, in a lot of ways, a response. I think Eric Foner would argue I'm sorry, in a minute, Jerry. In a lot of ways, he would consider it a friendly uh, response and further development of Black Reconstruction. I think we would see it a bit differently. There is a strong ideological difference on the question of democracy and its future. The other thing, just one small other thing. Like Kathy was at a conference of the American Historical Association, and they had a panel on teaching Black Reconstruction, not teaching just Reconstruction, teaching Black Reconstruction in high school.
K to 12 school.
Is it? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting because the panel emerges, I think I mentioned it to a couple folks so far. It emerges from the Howard Zinn Education Project, very prominent, I suppose, organization trying to reform American public school history education, social science education, but it was overwhelmingly interesting that in the last few years they've come to the topic of Reconstruction being definitely very challenging for any teacher to try to understand and then try to teach. Usually there's not enough time, or there really are what they say there's like, competing narratives, but what we would call the ideological struggle involved in trying to understand and interpret it. And they picked on the issue of states passing laws that prevent or make difficult the teaching of divisive concepts of history as sort of an attack on critical race theory or attack on woke ideology. And so they felt very like this is a very defensive project, but the way they had come out with a report called Teach Reconstruction, which I think you can find online as well, they were, first of all, promoting it as being endorsed by Eric Foner. That was one of their biggest selling points. And then second of all, they did repeatedly invoke Du Bois, even though among them they also invoked a lot of contemporary scholars that were very also much in the vein of doing this from a very different standpoint. I feel as if it was just the stakes that they see it in is very different than how we understand it as, very crucial to helping us all understand the revolutionary American process, versus they would say it is reacting to perhaps Trumpism or different reaction, like what they deem as fascist or reactionary tendencies. So even though they will somehow position Du Bois as being sort of part of their project, anyway, all that's to say is that I met people in that room. I only caught a little bit of it because I had a very busy day that day, that had also expressed so much interest in Black Reconstruction, and it helped us realize how hot of a topic it is, more broadly even than just that altogether. Writers for TV shows that had been doing reading groups of Black Reconstruction the last year, alongside academics who have been trying to resuscitate it in their own kind of way. So I don't mean to say all that to say that we need to investigate all of them, but I think we are trying to keep a pulse on what else is being, how else is Black Reconstruction being talked about, and all their different interpretations and how they stray away from what we're trying to do in some ways.
Just one small thing. Yeah, this is so important. I think I shared with a lot of people a discussion between Eric Foner and Henry Louis Gates on Black Reconstruction. And whereas in the past, even in Horn's Nation article, he, on the question of the general strike, he said, well, it wasn't a general strike, it was more like a wildcat strike. But anyway, we'll come back to him in another time. But in this Henry Louis Gates Eric Foner thing, Henry Louis Gates acknowledge it begins with the black worker. That's the first chapter. And then there's the general strike discussion. So it is a seriousness about this. And of course, when there's an essay in the New York Times on the editorial page, kind of praising something, at least this concept of abolitionist democracy. But here, I think, Kathy, you will agree with me, the difference, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeremiah in a minute, is that they see it, just as you said, as a part of the liberal struggle against fascism.
Right.
And that's in Henry Louis Gates, that's in and Eric Foner's discussion, and it's all over the place. So, I mean, like they say, a concession has been made, but let's not confuse the concession with a ideological victory for Black Reconstruction, or for the concept, even when they use the concept abolition democracy, they're talking about, the liberal struggle to maintain control of the state. But go ahead, Jerry.
No, well, even what you're saying and what Kathy was saying, it makes me think about how, in a lot of ways, reading Black Reconstruction contrary to those narratives, it actually makes you either embrace or see the possibility more, even in the Trump movement. And that it's one of those ironic things where they're using it against Trump, but actually we see it more of like, oh, actually, Black Reconstruction helps you to clarify and understand, like from an explanatory standpoint, like, oh, this is why, what's happening with the Trump movement beyond even Trump himself is so significant, because you could interpret it as a break away from the kind of consensus that Du Bois talks about with the counter-revolution of property, the sort of like the ruling class being able to like grab the white worker and to make the white worker think that his interests were aligned with the capitalist class and all that stuff. And I think that that's an important point that needs to be made at some point. But the other thing I was going to say is that even on
Can I just make just a small point? Because in Henry Louis Gates and Eric Foner, they say it's a Marxist interpretation of Reconstruction. They say that about Du Bois. Right. Now, the question is, yes, Du Bois is appropriating Marx and class and all of that, but he's also, this is where the synthesis is so important. I think it is, if it is Marxist, it's more towards Lenin. But I'll just stop.
Yeah, because so I have been reading State and Revolution by Lenin past few days, and I think even to this question of democracy and revolution, it's like after reading Lenin, it makes me feel or consider whether one of the principal differences or almost departures that we're making with Du Bois and with the American revolutionary process is Lenin identifies democracy and revolution primarily with the state and the state form, whereas it's almost like we're working towards a thesis which is saying that we identify democracy and revolution with the state, but also with the social movement. And
from the bottom.
And I think that I say that partially because, if we think about this question of like the dialectic, but also what you've been writing about with like the trialectic or the dialectic of threes, if you think about it from like a conceptual standpoint, like the whole class dialectic is the proletariat like overcoming the capitalist class, like being born out of that like a new form. But if you think about the fact that if you have to consider race as not just a social contract, but an actual social organization of society, then it's a different kind of dialectic because it's not it's not like black people needing to supersede white people, right? It's a new interaction. Like there needs to be a new interaction which creates something new, but it's not just black people like being on top of white people, right? And it's different qualitatively than like the proletariat overcoming the bourgeoisie. And I think that we have to consider both of those kinds of dialectics operating, and that leads to different considerations of actually what is a revolution. Because and I'm still trying to think this out, but one could say that the revolution as seen through American history is not just the overturning of the rule of a class or of the overturning of a particular rule of a class through the state, but it is also the overturning and transformation of a kind of social relation.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, for me, it's still very hazy, but I feel like that's one of the important points that we could be making with the Du Bois event, because like something that people say a lot is that racism is an outgrowth of capitalism, right? And I think that is true, but like how do you explain the fact that even while, or like racism is an outgrowth of imperialism, how can you explain the fact that even while like from the 50s onwards, American imperialism was strengthening and growing more like global, more rapacious, all of these things, but simultaneously, how is it that the civil rights movement was able to actually overcome, to be in a process of overcoming racism while that simultaneous process is happening with imperialism? And that's not to say that they're disconnected, but that there's a different kind of dynamic that's possible given the kind of conditions of American history that have unfolded because of basically going back to like the existence of the slave, the black worker, and like existing within the framework. But yeah, I've just been thinking about that in relation to Lenin and Du Bois, because I think in a lot of ways, something that I like about reading Lenin is that, and also Du Bois, but Lenin in particular, it's very clear that it's a work of theory, but it's precisely a work of abstract thinking becoming concrete, becoming very concrete, because he's having to think through not just theoretical, but also ultimately practical questions of, okay, like there has been a so-called revolution where the Mensheviks have allied with like the bourgeois Democrats, and this is what they propose for Russia, but like we propose something different and we're going to implement this. And like it's like the abstract becoming concrete. And I think that in a lot of ways is also like the kind of thinking that we're doing in this time of like theoretical questions becoming very concrete. But yeah.
Wow. Danny, reminds me of the Lenin's phrase that you told me about last week. How a concrete study of the concrete. It is so poignant. A concrete study of the concrete, which requires a theoretical framing of the concrete to study but the other thing is, this is Serafina's point about new categories of knowledge, and the black worker as not just a concrete form of the working class, but a category through which to understand the fight for democracy and the class struggle itself. The other thing, I think a lot of people, this is so interesting. Is not the class conflict itself an expression of the democratic struggle from below, as you say? And is not the democratic struggle an expression of the class struggle? Hence, Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. The church, is not the church a form of class organization? You know, we're going down to the Church of the Overcomer. I mean, does it get more working class than this? You know, are they not? And then, of course, if you say that the class struggle is the democratic struggle, are we then not saying that the class struggle is a political struggle almost always? And so I'll shut up there, but I think that's where we're going with this thing of democracy and then even the synthesis, because we have to be clear about what we're synthesizing about Lenin and Du Bois.
Right.
Why the synthesis? And we haven't worked it out yet. And what are we synthesizing? And I think you got it right in a lot of ways on this, Jeremiah. It is about democracy. It is about the state, but it is about this concept of, well, I guess as Derek puts it, unusual
dynamics.
Unusual
That's
dynamics.
what I was thinking about too.
Yeah, unique dynamics, unique dialectics.
Yeah.
Theorizing from the standpoint of a people and a nation that you're talking about democracy, but not as an anti-aristocratic struggle, not as a struggle for democracy against aristocratic institutions in the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because when we think of the church in the United States, we're not thinking of the Catholic Church. That's one of them. But most people, when they say the church, they mean the church they go to. You know what I'm saying? So I'll stop there. Yeah, go ahead.
One question actually I was talking to a coworker about the other day was the difference between a coup and a revolution. And because I think this is part of the conversation we're having is a lot of people really just make those things synonymous, just this violent overthrow of a small group of people in the state. And I guess the things that come to my mind, I think part of what I'm hearing is this idea that Lenin talked about of you can't have a real revolution without revolutionary theory, revolutionary ideas, as well as, you know, revolution or
And a revolutionary party.
Right. But a party that's united with the majority of people,
Yes.
a party that actively tries to unite the majority of working people. Whereas I think a coup in my mind, I mean, I don't know what the exact definition is, but when I think of coup, I think of a group of people that's actively working to divide people and is separate from the people in a very significant way. And as well as seeing only violent means of military in order to maintain that. So I just think that question is something that, especially in America, it's very troubling that we can only see revolution through this very top-down way, this very brutal and rigid way. So I just thought, I don't know what your answer to that
I
is,
think
but-
it's very important. You know, I just brought a book today for Jeremiah by Richard Pipes called The Russian Revolution, which might be the best history of the Russian Revolution. That doesn't mean it's all agreed with, but there are two interpretations. So you got John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World from Below. You get Richard Pipes, The Russian Revolution, who does see it as a coup, you know. But the Russian Revolution was hardly violent at all. I don't know whether John Reed makes this point. I think he does. But the fact of the matter is the state collapsed. Don't forget, in February, the Tsar and his family fled the Winter Palace, and they gave in. Just like the Qing dynasty, am I pronouncing the Qing dynasty in 1911, fled, and Sun Yat-sen. And so the state collapsed, and the revolutionaries, in this case, Lenin, said, this is the way we move forward. I don't know, and you're right about this, Jerry. We got to work this out in the round table. Can we, oh God, this is the complexity. Can we look at a collapse of the US state? this very modern, very powerful instrument. It's not like the czars, old, decrepit, over the hill, or the Qing dynasty. I mean, thousands years old, on its last legs, and kind of buried itself, which gives greater meaning to what I think you're saying, Jerry. The people become more important, and this is this thing of movement and party.
Yeah.
Well,
And just one small last point. This is Danny and I. We go back. We've been discussing this. If Trump, and we can't be these kind of purists where you can't mention Trump unless you call him a fascist. Trump is, in terms of American politics, there has not been, maybe since Lincoln, a political figure that so dominated the politics of the nation. I mean, you can't open up a newspaper or turn on the news and the first or second story is not something about Trump. So what Trump does will have a big impact upon the politics. And again, the democratic struggle, the class struggle is not ultimately, is by definition political, a political struggle rooted in the democratic struggle. But if Trump decides to run as an independent, Danny, you mind if I say what you said you would do?
Sure.
Over at Allison and Adam's crib, me and Danny, we should have been having more fun. We were having fun. And Caleb, we're rapping the whole time. And Danny says that if Trump decides to run as an independent, he will support Trump and join the campaign. Is that fair to say?
Sure.
I took that to mean not just what Danny would do, but a lot of the young disenchanted people who supported Bernie Sanders and were betrayed now find themselves in various movements, MAGA communists, and so on and so forth. The betrayal of the young generation and it reclaiming, and this is it, reclaiming the young generation through this struggle literally against the state. I mean, maybe Trump won't see it that way, or maybe he does see it that way. But certainly, young people, let us say, who were 20 when they came out supporting Bernie, are now close to 30, have had all of these experiences, have not given up on their dreams. And that's very important. And that's, I'm talking a little too much, but that gets to your point that the democratic struggle is deep rooted in the American people and in young people whose college educations tell them they should be cynical. Enough of them still believe in their dreams. And they're going to find a way to make those dreams a reality among young people. And if this goes down like Danny and I were talking, it is, and I use the word loosely, a revolution, a radical redoing of American politics. Trump begins with having gotten 74 million votes in 2020, the second highest. Biden got the most, and we don't know who was counting all the votes, by the way. I'm so suspicious of the 2020 election. But anyway, the guy starts, no American politician that I can, and somebody can do the history, they might find it. No American politician has ever had the loyalty of so many millions of people. No one. That is a qualitatively new situation. Okay, I'll shut my mouth. But I think in the town hall, we're going to have to tease this out.
That's the question.
You know, anybody else? Danny, want to say something? Go.
Just excited for the event.
Say that
I'm
again.
just excited for the event.
It's
First,
yeah.
Now that we've kind of fleshed it out, and we've been reading, preparing for it. Now that it's falling into
Yeah,
place, and
yeah.
we've seen all the stakes, I'm excited for what we're doing.
And I'm always so interested in hearing the stories of your parents. I won't name everybody's parents, but when members of the free school tell me that, well, my dad voted for Trump. And you say, well, why? He said, one, and I get this from two people, I won't name them now, but two people, your dad said the same thing. Yeah. The media was lying. Can I use your name? Okay, I'll use Jeremiah's dad. And Samir's dad. I know Samir's dad. I don't know Jeremiah's dad. But your dad said the same thing. The media was lying so badly. He must be doing something right. It was a deductive argument, I guess you could call it that. But now, of course, you take Black folk. We're burdened, and I put quotes around this. FDR, John F. Kennedy, Johnson, the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Bills, and Obama. So there's a certain emotional, practical, even ideological connection to a Democratic Party that no longer exists. And by the way, so many Black folk are now coming to this conclusion. And the failure of the Black misleadership class to change the Democratic Party in our behalf. And when people look at cities with Black mayors, the Black Congressional Caucus voting for these military budgets, nothing changing. In a city like Philadelphia, more violent, less educated, more dirty, more homeless, they're saying, wait a minute. The promise of FDR or even Obama, whatever that meant, symbolically, have not been fulfilled. And then in 2022, young Black people increased their vote for Republicans by 22%. I think it may have been 2020, of course, an increase of 22%. That is not a small matter. Now, these are, I think they were saying 20 to 40-year-olds, not the highest voting group, but nonetheless, if it is happening, if Black people are leaving the Democratic Party, and we know Mexican Americans and other Spanish speakers are, Asians, a similar process. This is huge. And if he comes forward with this movement, which means he's not constrained by the part of the Republican Party which will stab him in the back. I think he knows this. His chances at running as a Republican are severely reduced because of the Mitch McConnell's, the Republican Party establishment, which would unite with Biden, who looks like he will be their candidate, to take Trump down, anybody but Trump. As an independent, he doesn't have to make any compromises. I don't know what y'all think. If Danny, what do you think he would make that move as an independent? How do you read the tea leaves?
I don't think so, but
Oh, you don't think so? Okay.
I mean, it would be great, but I don't. That's my prediction.
You're not feeling too optimistic this morning.
Well, it's just my prediction. I don't. That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. The stakes are very high, of course. That kind of move.
Because I feel like he would have to do it today if it's already 2023.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
It's a question of timing. He has to, yeah. I see what you're saying.
I mean, if there was the Bull Moose Party, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That, I don't know. It's just a prediction. It's not what I like. It's just a prediction.
Well, the last one that did it was the guy with the
Ross Perot.
Yeah, Ross Perot.
Yeah.
And it was he damn near won. He split the vote, I think in 1992, 3 ways, which literally gave the election to Bill Clinton. Without Ross Perot, old man Bush, the old Bush, would have won, I think. But it was because of Ross Perot that Clinton could win. But Ross Perot was not starting from and he was a character in his own right, but he was running on, too many taxes. What are we getting for this? Just an anti kind of, but not Trump, not a Trump thing, where he's taking on foreign policy and domestic policy and the elites that run the state. To answer the question I asked Danny, I think it's better than 50-50 that he will run as an independent. He can't run there's no path in the Republican Party. Now he's already announced that he's running. He did not say that he will be running as a Republican, remember. And the speech that he gave was not a speech trying to win over his opposition in the Republican Party. And there's political political studies over and over again recently that show that the Republicans or the Trump wing of the Republicans is becoming a working class party. This is not so if Trump is serious about running, I don't think he could run in the Republican Party because his base, and this is what the 2022 election showed, the people who vote for Trump are voting for him because he's going against established Republicans.
Yeah.
And even if you take Arizona with the woman that lost for governor, what they are saying is that they were stabbed in the back by Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. You see what I'm saying? It's such a fluid moment, and it's so pregnant with all of the questions of democracy, as you put it, from below. The people are determining this, either by voting or not voting. I think Trump understands this as well as anyone. But go ahead, Jay.
Oh no, just reading some comments. Nathan, Todd, Allison, Stephen Palmier all say good morning. Stephen Palmier asks, where he says, Trump has the Republican Party sewn up. Why would he throw that organization out? He's never worried about any opposition in the Republican establishment. He trounces them in debates. And I think it's a valid point because Trump does still hold influence in the Republican Party, and people have different opinions about exactly how influential he is. Even in terms of the recent Freedom Caucus, Speaker of the House situation, some people were saying, "Oh, actually, he's not that influential." But I think it is true that they're trying to paint him as someone whose influence in the party is decreasing.
Yes.
And that may be true, but I think still a lot of people are scared to go against Trump outright within the GOP. And then Jahan says, good morning. Maybe if Trump is treated badly in the Republican Party, he can run as a third party candidate. It would be interesting if the Freedom Caucus and Trump developed a quote unquote Freedom Party. If this is the greatest crisis since the Civil War, we can look back to the election of 1860, in which a third party candidate, Abraham Lincoln, of the new Republican Party at that time, beat multiple candidates to win. Virginia Kotz also says, good
Is
morning.
everybody aware of that?
I didn't.
Now I
Oh,
am.
this is very, very important. The Republican Party that Lincoln ran, I think at first, did he run as a Whig in 1856? And then the Whig Party died, and then they invent the Republican Party, which was a completely new party. You know what I'm saying? So this is not, there is precedence for this. And as Jahan says, that, what did Jahan say? Oh, as Jahan, anyway, the greatest crisis since the Civil War. So if there's an analog maybe that we could look back to, it is the crisis of the Civil War period, crisis over slavery, which was the crisis over democracy. But I'm sorry, maybe there are
The
other.
important difference between then and now, though, is sort of the structure of the electoral process in this country. It's
That's
become
right.
much more
I agree with
consolidated
that.
among these two parties, and it's much more difficult to break through that, I think, since that time, as far as I understand.
But the divisions over slavery and free soil, let us put it that way, were analogous to the divisions today.
I would say so.
And like you say, you can win an election and lose the people. You can lose an election and win the people.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Which is back to your point, Jerry, of democracy from the people, and a people who have the capacity to know, to see, to evaluate, to make judgments. Not all the same, not all this, like you say, your dad said, hey man, they're lying so much about this guy. There must be something good in him that he's, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, however people arrive at this, the engagement or involvement of people in politics is greater today. And in fact, how do I put it? If you look at the political universe, of institutions, individuals, parties, the masses, the people are more politicized today than any time I know in your memory or in mine. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, because I think part of the reason why earlier I was saying that we could hypothetically identify even these questions of democracy and revolution, not only with the overturning of a state, but with a true people's movement, is because it's in the process, even whether you look at the Civil War, the abolitionist movement, the emancipation movement, the general strike, or if you look at the Civil War or the civil rights period, it's these particular kinds of social movements which are aimed at the remaking of the social relation amongst the people. It's so interesting how those movements themselves also, it's almost like they bend the entire country, but also including politics, including the state itself towards that. It's because the way that
could you formulate bending?
It's almost like the way that Du Bois talks about, Abraham Lincoln. He didn't start out in the Civil War being pro-emancipation, but it's the black worker, the crucial significance of the black worker to the victory or defeat of the Union Army. It's they bended Lincoln towards becoming a force for emancipation. And I don't know exactly how to relate this to even what Lenin was laying out, but it's similar to even the civil rights movement, where it's like they weren't exactly aimed at like taking over state power, but still they bent the entire government towards them, and they bent it almost to the point of breaking it, basically. And even Trump, even Trump, it's like this movement has like bent obviously all of political discourse, but even like you could say even like the government towards it. And the question is like, can a movement emerge which is aimed at both like completing the task of the civil rights movement in terms of the complete remaking of social relations among the people, but which also bends all of like the existing actual state itself towards it in a way which could like potentially overcome.
This is very
But
Yeah.
it's very interesting.
yeah. Wow. Any more comments?
Stephen Palmier says Tulsi Gabbard has a real opportunity to start an alternative party that unites a class-oriented coalition.
I would say Tulsi Gabbard has the possibility, which I think she's going to do. It's just like us. If Trump runs, Tulsi Gabbard will support Trump even if he runs as a Republican. But if he runs as an independent, she will be a part of his movement, whatever it's called. I know she, and then of course she might run for the U.S. Senate from Hawaii. In that kind of configuration, all kind of. If Trump runs as an independent movement, makes a lot of things possible, which are not possible within the two-party configuration. I mean, it's like a new situation. And of course, this is why I guess we're going to, whether I know we have to take up the Trump question.
Right.
There's no way we can just, walk around and not take this movement seriously. And what are its possibilities? And yeah, I'll say, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
You had mentioned your skepticism about the 2022 campaign.
Yes.
Or the 2020 campaign.
Both.
And I was gonna mention my skepticism about the 2000 campaign, and it keeps going back. And Emil and I were talking on Thursday about President Nixon and the way we were talking a little bit about coup d'état and revolution, and how Nixon had. Emil and I were talking about how Nixon had bridged the gap between China, ended the Vietnam War, and then was made out to be a crook and basically forced to resign. But it turned out that Deep Throat, the leak, came from the FBI. And it reminded me about, we haven't had time to discuss the Twitter files, which I'm not really sure I understand the whole scope of it, but it looks like national security interests manipulated social media.
Could I just, everybody might not know what you're talking about Watergate, Deep Throat.
Sure.
If you don't, unless you want to, I mean,
I don't know anything about it.
Well, it's very important. I have to say, I hated Nixon all the time. I mean, as much as you can hate somebody you don't know. But the question of the way he was taken down, and among the issues that one would have to consider were the opening to China. The other thing is, would the war in Vietnam have ended sooner? Was he prepared in this move towards China and this, this vision of a new political world order? Did that mean going along with that, withdrawing from Vietnam? Well, we don't know. But one thing we do know, and this is a thing they kept secret for about 40 some years or maybe more, who was Deep Throat. Because there were two Washington Post journalists that broke the story. Bob Woodward, who was still active in talks, and the other guy, I forget his name. What was the other guy's name? Danny Woodward, and two young Washington,
Daniel Ellsberg? Is it?
Huh?
Ellsberg?
No, not Ellsberg.
He's
That's
Pentagon
the Pentagon Papers. But there was, anyway, there were two of them, two young Washington, and they got the story from a person they claim was Deep Throat. Come to find out that this was an FBI agent. So the question, which is still out there, and because Nixon was so hated, people don't give, F him, he's gone, so on and so forth. But the question of what was the role of the FBI, which meant the state, the deep state, in bringing him down. And why did they have why were they interested in bringing him down? Because Watergate was something so small. In other words, a group of people associated with the Republican Party broke into a Democratic, well, maybe the Democratic Party headquarters in a hotel called the Watergate. I mean, something like that today would be brushed as, oh God, just a bunch of bunglers, didn't know what the hell they were doing, trying to I don't know what they were trying to get, because back then things were so simplified and, I don't know. But anyway, something so small leads to a president being brought down. Really, something small and such. So when you get to the Twitter files make Watergate look like kindergarten kids. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, I cut you off, Samir. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, I mean, that brings us to the present with the Twittergate, we'll call it.
Yeah. And explain what the Twitter files are in case people.
I guess Elon
Too
Musk.
many of them.
Yeah, there's all these posts. Elon Musk is working with journalists.
Now, Elon Musk bought Twitter.
Yeah, he bought Twitter, and I guess he's trying to spend that money in a very narcissistic way just to get back at people very pettily.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
No, maybe
not.
Oh, hold on, wait a minute. There could be a political point here.
Yeah, he's making a political point.
Because what the Twitter file, and he released them to a journalist, Matt Taibbi, who is not mainstream, right? He's a non-mainstream critic of the establishment. Elon Musk released these files, and it's not the totality, showing that the FBI, here we are again, FBI, were involved with Twitter and Facebook, in particular Twitter, in suppressing certain stories. In other words, you know how you use algorithms, and then if the algorithms don't work, you got these people who are supposed to protect our democracy and freedom of speech, right? In Twitter. And they monitor certain sites. Thus far, I hope you don't mind just, thus far, the big story that they show was suppressed at the urgings and the direction of the FBI was the Hunter Biden story, which linked Biden himself, the current president, to the Ukraine and to money making in this energy company, Burisma, in the Ukraine. Now, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Samir.
No, that's a good summary. And it's Elon Musk has his own motives. Maybe he wants to get into politics, but he definitely bought Twitter because, as he said, it was the public sphere.
Yeah.
And
he's a libertarian.
And he's got some sort of commitment to freedom of speech. but also Bezos has bought, the Washington Post,
Mhm.
and Mark Zuckerberg owns Facebook, which also has all these algorithms, and they, sometimes they shadow ban people. Like I follow Vanessa Beeley and Ayla Barrett, but if I don't actually look at their profile, I can't see their stuff coming to my feed. So I'm aware that they're very pro-Syria journalists, but I'm aware that that information is being hidden from me. But it just goes to show that every president from Nixon and probably Johnson to now has been on the side of the security state. And it's just so shocking to me that so-called leftists can't make this connection
Well,
today.
can I just interrupt you? It's not, yeah, you said on the side of the security state, or recognizing that the real center of power is the security state. That being president does not mean that you're over the FBI. The FBI might know some things about you or your family, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the case of Biden and Hunter Biden, his son, the state were protecting them from the journalists and others in social media who were talking about, Hunter Biden's laptop, that Hunter Biden, this guy is a damn mess. He took his laptop with all of this information about his father and even about himself. And he's a fucked up cat. I mean, he's a sick man, I put it that way. All that shit was on the laptop. He took it to be fixed to a
repair shop.
A repair shop in Wilmington, Delaware. And the cat turned it over.
Well, because he forgot about it, and after a certain time, under like legal agreements, then it becomes the property of the store.
And all
it's not like he even stole it. It was just like.
And so the New York Post, which is a tabloid newspaper, got this shit, and they were reporting on it. This is at the very moment that we're having the 2020 election. If this becomes part of, and this was a razor thin election, let nobody tell you otherwise because of the Electoral College. A few thousand votes. 2020 was a repeat of 2016. And had the story of Hunter Biden, which is the story about Joe Biden, been revealed, this would have been a center point of the debate. And a corrupt, because the thing, if I might just say, 2020 and more so in 2022 and 2024, they have to criminalize Trump and his closest associates. What the Hunter Biden thing does is to flip the narrative. Oh, you're saying I'm a criminal? Well, look at what these guys are doing. Now you get this whole thing of the Twitter thing, but Biden himself, over the last 7 years, having had classified documents in not just one house, but several houses.
Right.
So you're trying to criminalize this guy, right? And now, are you an equal criminal, or maybe a worse criminal? You see the fluidity and the contradictoriness of the whole situation. You take a cat like Elon Musk. When it gets to understanding all of what drives people to do things, you say, well, he's the richest man in the world. Why would he go against the establishment? Well, that's a good question. The fact of the matter is he is going against what is the current establishment. Who is the current establishment? Bi-coastal elite, East and West Coast elite, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and in between everything else, the banks, big financial institutions, and high big tech. And then you throw in there one of Samir's favorites, cryptocurrencies. But no, I'm only joking. I mean, you put all of this in the fucking mix. People are breaking in different ways. We don't know. Does he? What are his? Why would Elon Musk do this? Why would he even buy Twitter? $40 billion. I mean, okay, he's a trillionaire. 40 billion might not be a lot to him, but why would he even f with this?
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter, maybe we'll learn that 50 years from now when he writes his autobiography. But for the time being, the political effect is that the ruling class, the only way they can run against Trump effectively is to make him a criminal and his movement a fascist movement. But now the shit becomes the opposite. Oh, now the Republicans, under this guy, this pro-Trump congressman from Ohio, Jim Jordan, and these are not the perfect people. I mean, he doesn't speak like a Harvard-educated lawyer or a professor. He's not, he's a rough-hewn cat out of Ohio. I don't know where the hell he's from, but he's a, and fingers in. It's just like Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, I don't know whether you want to have her over for dinner, but the effect of what she is doing, and this is what we're interested in from our point of view, because we're not making decisions from the level of the elite. Let them do them. Let them handle their contradictions, which are also contradictions produced by the alienation of the people from the establishment. But we're looking at how's this affecting the people. I know Emily, her union, she's always talking to union members. You know what I'm saying? We're churches and shit. How do people see this? But the effect is that you can't call Trump a criminal without calling Biden a criminal. And now Jim Jordan and them are going to have a church type commission. Senator Church from the state of, to bring everything up to date. Senator Church from the state of Idaho, small state, initiated in the mid-70s an investigation of the illegal activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. And it might have had something to do with his short life. Suddenly he has cancer, But yeah, right. You pay a price. You attack the CIA, you don't live.
Exactly.
But yeah.
That's wild.
He sets up a committee, or in a committee that he headed in the U.S. Senate, to investigate the illegal activity of the CIA in domestic politics. The CIA, the FBI, division of FBI handled domestic, CIA handled foreign, and they're not operating in the interest of democracy, I can tell you that. And they found, and I forget everything, but it was enough to bring into question the operations of the deep state, what we call the deep state, in the day-to-day lives of democratic movements. What is this whole fucking thing about that we're looking at? I think there's a reason to analyze all these, be it the Twitter files, be it the criminalization and labeling all these people as fascists. The way this January 6th committee, which was a show trial of the worst type, you know what a show trial is. It's not based on law. It's based upon, I'm going to take all the people and put them on trial. And you know, I already know they're guilty, but it's a trial to show that they're guilty to the public. That's what January, because it wasn't the Justice Department, whatever that is, going after people, or local prosecutors going after people. It was the January 6th committee establishing guilt. And remember that whole narrative about when is Garland, wasn't it Garland, Merrick Garland? Whatever the guy that's the head of the Justice Attorney General, when is he going to act? The January 6th committee has exposed all of this, and these people are criminals, and we got pictures of them climbing through the windows and attacking our police officers, and so many of them didn't turn out. Nobody died on January 6th. Cat had a heart attack on January 7th or 8th. Another cat committed suicide. So, I mean, the cat had problems going in. So don't blame it on, you know what I'm saying? Don't blame it on that cat with the moose head on. You remember that dude?
Yeah, I do.
He was a wonderful cat. I dug that cat. He was just walking around, you know. Yeah, just such a beautiful cat, man.
Doc, did you see they have a Brazilian version?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to go to that yet. I don't want to make that, because see, this feeds into that narrative
Yeah.
of Trump and Bannon are responsible for the Brazil. Let's hold them aside let's deal with our homegrown situation. So the church committee back in the 70s showed this. So now the Republicans, not through the Senate, through the House of Representatives, are setting up a similar investigation of the deep state's involvement in people's movements. And what they're saying, among other things, I don't know everything they're going to say, is that there were agent provocateurs planted in the January 6th thing. That in that thing in Michigan, where they're talking about these cats from a farm, somewhere in Michigan, cats that had no means, no way to do anything, are suddenly conspirators who want to kidnap the governor. And then come to find out the person who made the suggestion was an FBI plant. So I just say all of this, it gets back to our question of democracy.
The stream. No, I'm looking at the stream. Sometimes the owl seems to have fallen asleep or something.
Who fell asleep?
The
Is it
owl.
backward?
Yeah, because
Oh,
they're
okay.
awake in the
It's
night,
back.
right?
Okay. The owl.
Jahan commented on YouTube.
Yeah.
Turned off.
Okay,
Talking
so
to church, maybe.
There's a lot of comments.
Okay.
Virginia Cotts asked, "Is Trump the only person who could win as a third-party candidate?"
Yes.
Jahan adds on YouTube, "I believe Nixon was the first U.S. president to visit the Soviet Union soon after his China visit.
Sorry.
To engage in talks for détente with the Soviet leadership. FDR had visited Soviet territory, but Nixon was the first since the start of the Cold War to also the first to visit the capital of Moscow for talks, and leading to SALT I and other arms control agreements." And then Virginia and Yvonne had said that the other reporter during the Watergate scandal was Carl Bernstein.
Yeah, Bernstein.
So Woodward and Bernstein. Virginia Cott says, "Committee to re-elect the president." She may be talking about Trump. I'm not sure.
She's talking about Nixon.
Okay. Yvonne says, "Musk has also released some Twitter files to at least one other journalist." Yeah, I think it was like Barry Weiss was another one.
Okay.
And then Lee Fang, who writes for The Intercept, and then another guy, Leighton Woodhouse, who's like an independent journalist. Virginia asks, Tony, I'm told we're not supposed to call it the Ukraine anymore, just Ukraine. But I don't know why, do you? I think it's to make it seem more legitimate as a country rather than like as a region. You know, like the
That's what
Donbass or
That's
something.
what they say.
Well, please help me with this.
Well, because I got into like an argument with like one of my Ukrainian American classmates about this because I called it the Ukraine in front of her, and then she like went like ape shit on me. So
But she was like, it's Ukraine.
yeah, because so she said that the with the article the in front of it is an old Soviet term, and I mean you can kind of guess where this is coming from. She basically says that characterization frames Ukraine as a region and as like a shadow in the larger, I mean, or as like a little guy in like the larger like Soviet or Russian shadow, and that it's interesting because I think it's kind of similar to how like now the Western media is pushing to spell Kiev as Kiev.
Oh boy, this is Kiev.
Kiev.
Go ahead, keep
Something like that, or like Lvov is Lviv. So it's, I mean, I think that's the thing behind it. It's probably just semantics at this point, but coming behind it, I think there are very specific ideological aims.
And then Steven says Harry Truman started the so-called security state, and his election was decided by a very narrow margin in a three-way race. Truman was also the president during the Korean War.
Just in the 1948 race, and this is what ultimately led to a serious split in the left and McCarthyism. You had the Republican was who was, I forget his name, Dewey, Truman, and Wallace, Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace was a part of FDR's cabinet, a very prominent leftist, a genuine leftist. And when FDR died, the question is the vice president, who was his vice president at the time? I forget.
Who's vice?
FDR's vice
Wasn't
president.
it Truman?
Was it Truman? Oh, yes, this is right. No, let me get it right. The 1944 election, who would be FDR's running mate? Which would be an insurance policy when if FDR died. He was a very weak, sick man at the time, running for his fourth time for president. And the debate was over Henry Wallace versus Truman. Henry Wallace, an intellectual, party administrator. Truman was a cat that ran a hat store, haberdasher, and a bullshit artist, and whatever. And the weight of the establishment, including the bankers and everything, went towards Truman. Had Wallace been the candidate, the vice president, in a lot of ways we could say that American history going forward would have been different. So Pommier is right. But in the 1944 election, there was a lot of pressure from the left, a lot of support from the left, that Henry Wallace run as a third party, and he did, with the support of, among other people, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and prominent Democrats, small d Democrats, and anti-Cold War people. And this is the final blow that drove Du Bois out of the NAACP for the second time. And the NAACP then becomes aligned to the Democratic Party establishment. I think that's, but this is, it's what Stephen is saying is very, very important. That moment, but Henry Wallace, with all the mass support of the left unions, I think, but in the end, the election and everybody thought that the Republican was going to win. Dewey was going to win. And so the newspapers had already printed headlines the night before, Dewey wins or something like that. And it turns out Truman won. And, in terms of foreign policy and McCarthyism, the rest is history, including the Korean War.
Yeah, just a few more comments. Virginia says, the ruling class is not a monolith. There are divergent interests. I think she may be talking about Elon Musk. Todd Doherty says, the Scott Ritter banning, then unbanning, and then banning on Twitter, I think, is truly mind-boggling. Scott Ritter is like the...
They banned him.
Yeah, they banned him from Twitter, then they unbanned him, and then I guess they banned him again. Mr. Homebody, someone named Mr. Homebody on YouTube says, Ukrainian social media accounts also painted the fall of the Soviet Union as beneficial, despite the fact that they wouldn't exist without the USSR. Much love from New York.
There's no question. This is a question of what Anna was raising, her friend said. See, Ukraine as a socialist republic within this 15 republic Soviet Union, and Putin is right about it, was literally created by a political move on the part of the Bolsheviks. And it was a way, and the interesting thing is a number of leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, including, I think, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, were Ukrainians, but it secured Ukraine against Polish aims, and this was in 1922, I guess, around in that time. In other words, there were a lot of people, including Russia and Poland, who had claims on Ukraine. I mean, really, out of this war now, the West versus Russia, out of this war, which I think the Russians are going to win, are winning, the question is, what will be left of Ukraine? And the collapse of the Ukrainian state as we know it with this guy Zelensky, will that then embolden Poland to make its age-old territorial claims upon whatever's left of Ukraine? Obviously, just on the Ukraine thing, Ukraine will no longer, after this is over, have an outlet to the sea. It will be landlocked. You know what I'm saying? It will, and hence we're back to 1922. Will the existence of the Ukraine be dependent upon Russia? Who can defend? Because, Poland is a part of NATO. I mean, and the Germans and the French and the US, after this is over, are not going to be in a mood to defend Ukraine. So now we're back to Russia being the only power that will defend Ukraine, which is a great irony of this whole situation.
Okay, there's one last comment. Stephen Palmer says, there was an attempted coup.
Say that again.
There was an attempted coup on FDR's administration early on,
Yeah.
trying to use someone named Smedley as
a general.
Okay, as a leader, he exposed them on it, and it was buried big time.
Yeah.
Did you want to read about Reconstruction?
Yeah, hold on one second. Any other comments, questions?
Smedley Butler went to my high school.
Oh, wow. A cool plotter.
Uh-oh.
No, he was the one exposed.
Oh, he's the one that exposed.
He
Okay, I'm sorry.
exposed the business
He
plot.
wrote the book that War is a Racket.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Organized capital.
Right. Okay, so should we begin the chapter, the general strike? First, let me ask, is there anyone that wants to say anything to set it up, how we're approaching this?
What do you mean? Like reading and stuff?
No, read, but the politics, literally the politics of this chapter. And why it can be seen as the apropos Kathy's participation in the American Historical Association's panel discussing Black Reconstruction. This chapter could be the point that divides the House over how Black Reconstruction is received. I say that because I'm saying that unless one is prepared to adopt a more revolutionary view along the lines and logic of the book itself, one would have to diminish this chapter. Okay, so this is ideologically, along with the first chapter, The Black Worker, this chapter then sets the stage for the rest of the book politically. You dig what I'm saying? So it is politically significant. Kathy, would you mind reading? Could you read the first? Is that what epitaph? Yeah, whatever, See, I don't have a good vocabulary also. Sometimes. Go ahead, if you could start.
Sure, I can start.
Everybody sorry.
Chapter 4, The General Strike, How the Civil War Meant Emancipation and How the Black Worker Won the War by a General Strike which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force.
Could we just read that again? I don't know. Everybody have their, just everybody listen up to this.
How the Civil War meant emancipation and how the Black worker won the war by a general strike which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force.
I mean, that statement in and of itself is almost breathtaking. First of all, how the Black worker won the war. You see how this is the central chapter ideologically. How he didn't say the Black slave won, how the Black worker won the war. And then he goes on and he said, won the war by a general strike. Won the war by a general strike, which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invader, in whose army lines workers began to be organized as a new labor force. We could spend, this is so, I mean, it's excuse the reference to atomic weapons, but I only mean it metaphorically. This is an atomic bomb in the middle of the fucking history. This is not just a narrative against the Dunning school that said that Reconstruction was shit because black people was shit and yada, yada, yada. Okay, all right. That's an easy thing to take on. But here he is redefining the class struggle and the political, that the class struggle by definition is a political struggle. Even when the fucking leaders of the labor movement sell the fuck out, that's political. And hence began, in whose army line workers began to be organized as a new labor force. What he is saying, from the enslaved proletariat to a free worker. Whoa. And here's where bourgeois law, bourgeois liberty, freedom to organize, legal rights as individuals, blase, blase, blase. Hence, the overturning of Reconstruction was the overturning of this new labor force. Reconstruction not overturned the history of the working class in the United States is a different history. Frankly, I would argue unprecedented in modern history. Not constrained, we're talking about aristocracy, the church, the king, whatever. A new labor force and a new democracy. I could say that. This is why the categories of knowledge, and if you can't deal with that part of it, you don't understand what the fuck he's saying here. So when Horn talked, it wasn't a general strike, it was a wildcat strike. Did you read the fucking thing that he says at the fucking beginning? Did it mean anything? Now, let me show you. I mean, do you see? This is why Nuri went to cursing. When we were talking about a woman that does not curse, at least to my knowledge. Maybe others know her better, but she said, what the F is this? How do you diminish this, just this? Did you read that? Probably not. Okay, I'll shut my fucking mouth. Okay. Anybody want to say anything? Want to say anything, Michelle? Danny? Are we okay?
Let's read.
Yeah, let's read. Okay, let's read. Let's cut out the cursing and shit.
Would it help to just read and then or are there certain passages we can get to that? Yeah.
Why don't we just read?
When Edwin Ruffin, white-haired and mad, fired the first gun at Fort Sumter, he freed the slaves. It was the last thing he meant to do, but that was because he was so typically a Southern oligarch. He did not know the real world about him. He was provincial and lived apart on his plantation with his servants, his books, and his thoughts. Outside of agriculture, he jumped at conclusions instead of testing them by careful research.
Test for my hypothesis.
He knew, for instance, that the North would not fight. He knew that the Negroes would not revolt. And so war came. War is murder, force, anarchy, and debt. Its end is evil, despite all incidental good. Neither North nor South had before 1861 the slightest intention of going to war. The thought was in many respects ridiculous. They were not prepared for war. The National Army was small, poorly equipped, and without experience. There was no file from which someone might draw plans of subjugation. When Northern armies entered the South, they became armies of emancipation. It was the last thing they planned to be. The North did not propose to attack property. It did not propose to free slaves. This was to be a white man's war to preserve the Union, and the Union must be preserved. Nothing that concerned the amelioration of the Negro touched the heart of the mass of Americans, nor could the common run of men realize the political and economic cost of Negro slavery. When, therefore, the Southern radicals, backed by political oligarchy and economic dictatorship in the most extreme form in which the world had seen for 500 years, precipitated secession, that part of the North that opposed the plan had to hunt for a rallying slogan to unite the majority in the North and in the West, and if possible, bring the border states into an opposing phalanx. Freedom for its slaves furnished no such slogan. Not 1/10 of the northern white population would have fought for any such purpose. Free soil was a much stronger motive, but had no cogency in this contest because the free soilers did not dream of asking free soil in the South, since that involved the competition of slaves, or what seemed worse than that, of free Negroes. On the other hand, the tremendous economic ideal of keeping this great market for goods, the United States, together with all its possibilities of agriculture, manufacture, trade, and profit, appealed to both the West and the North, and what was then much more significant, appealed to the border states.
Does everybody know what the free soil movement was? Everybody know? Yeah, the free soil movement, of which Lincoln was a leader of, and being from Illinois, which when he says the West, he's talking about what we would today call the Midwest. The free soil movement was a movement of farmers. You could call it a petty bourgeois movement, because they did not want slave plantations to spread to Kansas, for example, or to Illinois, or to Ohio, because as was the case in the South, plantations deprive whites of property, and which was part of the explanation for the poor white, and what they came to be called hillbillies or rednecks, so they didn't want, so the free soil slogan was more appealing to the white population, many of whom would want to go west and get land, than was the slogan ending slavery.
The slogan was, "To the flag we are pledged, all its foes we abhor, and we ain't for the nigger, but we are for the war."
Oh my God. Ain't that deep? Okay.
The border states
Now everybody knows what the border states are. Delaware, Maryland, Tennessee, maybe parts of Arkansas. By this time, Kansas, which had gone through an earlier form of what would be the Civil War, had already fought and driven the slave owners out. John Brown, the great abolitionist, begins his career as an abolitionist freedom fighter in Kansas. Kansas became known as Bloody Kansas.
The border states wanted the Cotton Belt in the Union so that they could sell it their surplus slaves, but they also wanted to be in the same Union with the North and the West, where the profit of trade was large and increasing. The duty then of saving the Union became the great rallying cry of a war, which for a long time made the border states hesitate and confine secession to the far South. And yet, they all knew that the only thing that threatened the Union was slavery, and the only remedy was abolition. If now the far South had had trained and astute leadership, a compromise could have been made which, so far as slavery was concerned, would have held the abnormal political power of the South intact, made the slave system impregnable for generations, and even given slavery practical rights throughout the nation. Both North and South ignored in differing degrees the interests of the laboring classes. The North expected patriotism and union to make white labor fight. The South expected all white men to defend the slaveholders' property. Both North and South expected at most a sharp, quick fight and victory. More probably the South expected to secede peacefully and then outside the Union to impose terms which would include national recognition of slavery, new slave territory, and new cheap slaves. The North expected that after a threat and demonstration to appease its, quote, honor, unquote, the South would return with the right of slave property recognized and protected, but geographically limited.
Does everybody see the compromise? The South wanted a compromise where slavery would be protected nationally, right? Which meant the spread of slavery. The North wanted a compromise where the South would come back into the Union, but slavery would have been limited to the places where it already existed, pretty much. Which brings into question the question of Texas, which we won't get into yet.
Both sections ignored the Negro. To the northern masses, the Negro was a curiosity, a subhuman minstrel, willingly and naturally a slave, and treated as well as he deserved to be. He had not sense enough to revolt and help northern armies, even if northern armies were trying to emancipate him, which they were not. The North shrank at the very thought of encouraging servile insurrection against the whites. Above all, it did not propose to interfere with property. Negroes on the whole were considered cowards and inferior beings whose very presence in America was unfortunate. The abolitionists, it was true, expected action on the part of the Negro, but how much, they could not say. Only John Brown knew just how revolt had come and would come, and he was dead.
He was dead, executed by 1859.
Thus, the Negro himself was not seriously considered by the majority of men, North or South, and yet from the very beginning, the Negro occupied the center of the stage because of very simple physical reasons. The war was in the South, and in the South were 3,953,740 black slaves, and there were 261,918 free Negroes. What was to be the relation of this mass of workers to the war? What did the war mean to the Negroes, and what did the Negroes mean to the war? These were two theories, both rather over-elaborated, the one that Negroes did nothing but faithfully serve his master until emancipation was thrust upon him. The other that the Negro immediately, just as quickly, the presence of the Northern soldiers made possible, left serfdom and took a stand with the Army of Freedom. It must be borne in mind that 9/10 of the 4 million black slaves could neither read nor write, and that overwhelming majority of them were isolated on country plantations. Any mass movement under such circumstances must materialize slowly and painfully. What the Negro did was to wait, look, and listen, and try to see where his interests lay.
This is very interesting. Could not read or write, but understood where their interests lay. Isn't that something? Could not read or write, but understood they had an interest which was neither reflected by the northern armies nor the southern slave owners. This is a profound statement because, okay, let me shut up. I don't want to talk. Wow.
There was no use in seeking refuge in an army, which was not an army of freedom, and there was no sense in revolting against our master who were conquering the world. As soon, however, it became clear that the Union armies would not or could not return fugitive slaves, and that the masters with all their fume and fury were uncertain of victory, the slave entered upon a general strike against slavery by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave.
Can I just say something? Remember, although a proletariat and workers, they were property. And so in the early days of the war, the if the slaves ran away from the plantation, they would to the Union Army, they would be returned to the plantation, because the rules of the war at that time were not to take the property of the slave owners. So they were fighting the war based upon, we only want you to come back into the Union. We don't want to take your property, be it the land or the slaves.
He ran away to the first place of safety and offered his services to the Federal Army, so that in this way it was really true that he served his former master and served the emancipating army. It was also true that this withdrawal and bestowal of labor decided the war. The South counted on Negroes as laborers to raise food and money crops for civilians and for the army, and even in a crisis to be used for military purposes. Slave revolt was an ever-present risk, but there is no reason to think that a short war with the North would greatly increase this danger. Publicly, the South repudiated the thought of its slaves even wanting to be rescued. The New Orleans Crescent showed, quote, the absurdity of the assertion of a general stampede of our Negroes, end quote. The London Dispatch was convinced that Negroes did not want to be free, quote. As for the slaves themselves, crushed by the wrongs of Dred Scott and Uncle Tom, most provoking, they cannot be brought to burn with revenge.
Okay,
Yes.
everybody knows what he said when he says the Dred Scott decision. That was a struggle over if a slave reached a non-slave state, should he or she be returned to the slave state? In other words, could a slave not be a free person even in a state where there was no slavery? And what the Dred Scott decision said in 1857 was that a black, like Tony said, the head of the Supreme Court, a black man has no rights, a white man need respect, which means that a black man who was enslaved was always the property of a slave owner.
Because I have a question apropos your previous point. Because he's saying that the slave entered upon a general strike against slavery by the same methods that he had used during the period of the fugitive slave.
Okay, yes. Where the struggle over fugitive slave rights. You see, let me just make that clear. This is very, very important because slaves are always trying to flee the plantation. You know what I'm saying? And they saw their freedom in getting to a state where there was not slavery and where there were free Negroes who could protect them. Yes. So that was, and so what Du Bois is referencing is that until the Dred Scott decision, Black folk were fleeing. So let me just, this is very important because what Du Bois is also talking about is capacity, consciousness, interest, recognizing one's interest, but he is also saying that what culminates in a general strike had already been happening in a microcosmic way during the struggle over the fugitive slave laws, where different states would have different laws about what to do with, quote, fugitive slaves or slaves that, left the plantation. Were they still property, which meant that the slave owner could come, let's say, to Philadelphia and send her agents or, like thugs to say, Sade, you're the slave of some. We're taking you back down there.
Right.
That's what, Toni Morrison's book, Beloved, that's what that's about. And Setha kills her children. This is an actual story. Around Cincinnati, kills them rather than have them taken back to the slave thing. Yeah. And she said, I'd rather have you dead than slaves. And she was just a small thing about this. Since a slave was property, it was not considered a murder for her to kill her children. And the true story, this is a true story the novel is based upon. And as a consequence, Setha in the novel lived the rest of her life haunted by the child that she killed. I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
That's in my stomach, but
Yes, it's
it's
hard,
interesting,
yeah.
you know, because it's an example of like the proletariat, like in protest, like in
Yes.
the democratic, like struggling towards the democratic or democracy, because these are one of those like concrete realizations of like, okay, well, up until there is a decision by the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Which one, Dred Scott?
Yeah, you saw him talking about the fugitive slave running away to the state for freedom and things like that. Yeah, that as a part of like the democratic struggle. But also, what this made me think about was the, I guess, the dynamics, if you will, of the Black proletariat, or the, because we have two different things we're dealing with, like the enslaved African, and then it's becoming a Black proletariat. So the enslaved African also, it's property. It's a slave and a worker.
Yes.
And then, you know, as a proletariat, I think, you know, there's other dynamics to it. But I just was thinking about those things.
No, I think, but see, it's back to your point about philosophy and the category. See, the category slave, which is an ancient institution, people argue that all the time. But Du Bois substitutes the category worker. See what I'm saying? That move already creates a certain logic to the text and to the analysis. See, like he's saying, the North and the South looked upon the Negro as a slave by nature, you know, as a slave. That slavery was not unnatural. So if you go to make a natural law argument,
right?
They are natural. This is the natural state for a Black person to be a slave,
right?
But as a worker, so you just drop like that song said. I think it's by the Gap Band. You dropped the bomb on me, baby, you dropped the bomb on me. You know, it's about you dropped the bomb, and the bomb is so deep. I mean, you could go to 100 conferences on Black Reconstruction, and they never get this straight. They be, if you feel what I'm saying, I don't want to start cursing, but they fuck up because the historians don't know philosophy and the philosophers don't know history. So you get people talking about shit they're ill-equipped to talk about.
But also, but also part of the epitaph or whatever in the beginning, like how the Black worker won the war by general strike, which transferred his labor from the Confederate planter to the Northern invaders.
Right.
So it's not like the planters gave up the slaves to the North and the North were like, thank you for this labor force.
No.
But like there was a literal transition or redefinition or like a remolding of the state around the movements that the labor force or the Black proletariat were making, you know, historically.
It's breathtaking. It is so counter to all sides in the discussion of American democracy. This is so unique. I mean, in every dimension, so unique as to make it either it. See, you can't. Here's the thing with Du Bois. You debate Du Bois by ignoring Du Bois.
Yeah, right.
That's a debate. That's a discussion about. Or if you talk about him, you talk about it like Henry, if you get that thing, Henry Louis Gates, like he's writing a script for some bullshit PBS documentary about Reconstruction. You know what I'm saying? And it's all that laughing and bullshit. The fact of the matter, all of American social thinking is turned around with this, which then raises the question that Jerry, that you just put on the table. Are we looking at a dialectic or something closer to a trialectic? Because the dynamic agency of class are the African proletariat, not in a black separatist, i.e. Garveyite way. They would be, oh yeah, it shows that we should be. No, it didn't show that. He said a new labor movement. He didn't say movement, but you know what I'm saying. This is totally dismissed, which is, I think more about Nuri these days. I can't, which is infuriating. At least be honest about what we have here and the absolute genius of this. Everything is rethought now. But I'll shut my mouth, please.
Continue.
Yes. Want to say anything?
Not right now.
Let me pick up where we were. Their spies for their masters. Yeah. They obstinately refuse to run away to liberty, outrage, and starvation. They work in the fields as usual when the planter and overseer are away and only the white women are left at home, end quote. Early in the war, the South had made careful calculation of the military value of slaves. The Alabama Advertiser in 1861 discussed the slaves.
What page are you?
I'm at
58.
58.
Oh, we're goddamn.
Yeah, we were just.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The Alabama Advertiser in 1861 discussed the slaves as a military element in the South. It said that, quote, the total white population of the 11 states now comprising the Confederacy is 5 million, and therefore, to fill up the ranks of the proposed army, 60,000, about 10% of the entire white population will be required.
Proposal 600,000, by the way. Not
I didn't
60.
say-
Yeah.
You're right, 600,000. In any other country than our own, such a draft could not be met, but the southern states can furnish that number of men and still not leave the material interests of the country in a suffering condition. End
Everybody
quote.
knows what this, that the slaves would continue. The slaves would be a part of the Confederate military effort by producing export commodities and food. Now, where would cotton be exported to? To England, which was, in Horne's account, the abolitionist force during the American Revolution. So the British Crown went from an abolitionist force in 1776 to a pro-slave force in 1861. And this was the politics of the class struggle in England, where Marx and his followers played a huge role. And Marx was in essence saying what Du Bois is saying when he said, labor in the white skin cannot free itself as long as labor in the black skin is branded. Branded meaning enslaved. And thus, it is in the interest of the British working class to oppose the British ruling class siding with the slave owners. Oh, by the way, there was another triad here. Slave, the U.S. South, British manufactured, Indian, colonized India.
The editor, with fatuous faith, did not for a moment contemplate any mass movement against the program on the part of the slaves. Quote, those who are incapacitated for bearing arms can oversee the plantations, and the Negroes can go on undisturbed in their usual labors.
Mhm.
In the North, the case is different. The men who join the army of subjugation are the laborers, the producers, and the factory operatives. Nearly every man from that section, especially those from the rural districts, leaves some branch of industry to suffer during his absence. The institution of slavery in the South alone enables her to place in the field a force much larger in proportion to her white population than the North, or indeed any country which is dependent entirely on free labor. The institution is a tower of strength to the South, particularly at this present crisis, and our enemies will be likely to find that the quote moral cancer about which their orators are so fond of prating is really one of the most effective weapons employed against the Union by the South.
Do you see what he's saying? The fact that we have an enslaved working class is an advantage in a war with the North, where the South, even counting the slaves, has only half the population of the North. So, this is really advanced strategic thinking, because war is not just armies. War is production, which we're finding out in Ukraine, by the way. It's production. So, so this guy's saying, in war conditions, we have a more efficient war production system, even a better system for making money in trade with England. You see what I'm saying? The North has to raise an army from its working class and farming communities, which means then that the North would have to look elsewhere for the things that would be lacking in production. Yeah. Sorry. Bye-bye, Blaze.
Soon the South of necessity was moving out beyond this plan. It was no longer simply a question of using the Negroes at home on the plantation to raise food. They could even be of more immediate use as military labor to throw up breastworks, transport and prepare food, and act as servants in camp.
You see it? Without being paid.
In the Charleston Courier of November 22, able-bodied hands were asked to be sent by their masters to work upon the defenses. Quote, they would be fed and properly cared for, end quote. In 1862, in Charleston, after a proclamation of martial law, the governor and council authorized the procuring of Negro slaves, either by the planters' consent or by impressment, quote, to work on the fortifications and defenses of Charleston Harbor, end quote. In Mississippi in 1862, permission was granted the governor to impress slaves to work in New Iberia for salt, which was becoming the Confederacy's most pressing necessity. In Texas, 1,000 Negroes were offered by planters to work on the public defenses. By 1864, the matter had passed beyond the demand for slaves as military laborers and had come to the place where the South was seriously considering and openly demanding the use of Negroes as soldiers. Distinctly and inevitably, the rigor of the slave system in the South softened as war proceeded. Slavery showed in many, if not all respects, its best side. The harshness and cruelty, in part, had to disappear, since they were left on plantations mainly women and children, with only a few men, and there was a certain feeling and apprehension in the air on the part of the whites which had led them to capitalize on all the friendship and kindness which had existed between them and the slaves. No race could have responded to this so quickly and thoroughly as the Negroes. They felt pity and responsibility and also a certain new undercurrent of independence. Negroes were still being sold rather ostentatiously in Charleston and New Orleans, but the long lines of Virginia Negroes were not marching to the Southwest. In a certain sense, after a few first months, everyone knew that slavery was done with. that no matter who won, the condition of the slave could never be the same after this disaster of war. And it was, perhaps, these considerations more than anything else that held the poised arm of the black man, for no one knew better than the South what a Negro crazed with cruelty and oppression and beaten back to the last stand could do to his oppressor.
Whoa, which you see what Du Bois is just saying, and this is always a situation. The blacks could either show kindness towards the white slave owners in their time of trouble, crisis, or they could take the opportunity to exact revenge.
Right.
And the slave owners, the whites, North and South, by the way, didn't know what way the Negro would go.
That's scary.
Say that again.
I said, that's scary.
Yeah, well, can you imagine being a slave owner?
I know.
You know?
You just sitting there paranoid.
But see, here Du Bois, again, capacity, interest, consciousness, you know? And the other thing I just want to say here, the South and slave owners had generally a collective response to their crisis and need for labor and to the Negro. Why then would it be so difficult to deduce that the slaves saw a collective interest as well? Maybe not as clearly as the slave owners, but saw it. And but yeah.
The collective interest being
As a group. See, everybody, you know, because the slaves were isolated on plantations.
I know what you meant by as a group.
She said, what is the interest?
Huh?
Yeah, I know what you mean by as a group of, but I just didn't know what interest it would have been. It would have been the interest being what? What is the interest?
Freedom.
Okay.
See, because that's what the general strike was, a collective blow for freedom. You know what I'm saying?
A collective what?
Blow. Go ahead, AJ.
This is not related, but it's kind of related. I'm reading a book from Frederick Douglass. And so far what I've read about it, it's kind of bad.
Oh yeah.
Like in terms of how the slave owners treated their slaves and stuff, and not seeing them as a person, but as just property. And whenever even the smallest disobedient action, they would just get whipped.
Oh yeah. But see, this is very important. See, Frederick Douglass became well, put it this way, and Winston gets this. Frederick Douglass was like a Lenin of the anti-slavery struggle. You know what I'm saying? In other words, he was one who saw the whole picture. Everybody that was a slave, just like today, everybody doesn't see all of it. But those geniuses, those freedom fighters, and that's what Frederick Douglass, you know, he saw his condition and he saw the conditions of others. Now he's in Maryland. That ain't the hardest place. As South Carolina and Louisiana and them spots. But if he saw it, then there were others. This is what makes more plausible the concept.
There was one thing I read last night. How I think one of his family members, he didn't get to see them.
His mother.
His mother, and he didn't get to see her sick when she was sick and when she died and her
burial. Oh yes. The cruelty of it. The cruelty of it. And that's what Du Bois is also saying. And he says this throughout his work. Almost a transcendent humanity among the slaves, among Black folk. You know what I'm saying? Anybody else, if the shoe were on the other foot, few people would have treated Negroes the way Negroes treated their oppressors, so to speak. You know? And that's another point that Du Bois continues to make, the moral humanistic capacity. Yeah, you're right, AJ. And it relates directly to what we're talking about. You didn't take us off point. Okay.
The Southerners, therefore, were careful. Those who had been kind to their slaves assured them of the bad character of the Yankee and of their own good intentions. Thus, while the Negroes knew that there were abolitionists in the North, they did not know their growth, their power, or their intentions, and they did hear on every side that the South was overwhelmingly victorious on the battlefield. On the other hand, some of the Negroes sensed what was beginning to happen. Negroes of the cities, the Negroes who were being hired out, the Negroes of intelligence who could read and write, all began carefully to watch the unfolding of the situation.
Could we just read that again? See, this is very important. See, the assumption of most writers is that the Negroes were dumb. You know what I'm saying? Now, remember, Du Bois said in the population of 4 million enslaved Africans, there were 250,000 in the South, free Negroes. Now, we don't know what role the free Negroes played in organizing and spreading information among the slaves. You see what I'm saying? But we do know that they existed. But I'll just say it.
So I'll repeat that. On the other hand, some of the Negroes sensed what was beginning to happen. The Negroes of the cities, the Negroes who were being hired out, and the Negroes of intelligence who could read and write all began carefully to watch the unfolding of the situation. At the first gun of Sumter, the black mass began not to move, but to heave with nervous tension and watchful waiting. Even before war was declared, a movement began across the border. Just before the war, large numbers of fugitive slaves and free Negroes rushed into the North. It was estimated that 2,000 left North Carolina alone because of rumors of war.
It's a different trauma.
When W.T. Sherman occupied Port Royal in October 1861, he had no idea that he was beginning emancipation at one of its strategic points. On the contrary, he was very polite and said that he had no intention of interfering with slaves. In the same way, Major General Dix, on seizing 2 counties of Virginia, was careful to order that slavery was not to be interfered with or slaves to be received into the line. Burnside went further, and as he brought his Rhode Island regiment through Baltimore in June, he courteously returned 2 Negroes who tried to run away with him. They were, quote, supposed to be slaves, end quote, although they may have been free Negroes. On the 4th of July, Colonel Pryor of Ohio delivered an address to the people of Virginia in which he repudiated the accusation that the Northern Army were abolitionists. Quote, I desire to assure you that the relation of master and servant, as recognized in your state, shall be respected. Your authority over that species of property shall not in the least be interfered with. To this end,
Species of property.
To this end, I assure you that those under my command have peremptory orders to take up and hold any Negroes found running about the camp without passes from their masters. End quote.
You need a
Deep.
Halleck in Missouri in 1862 refused to let fugitive slaves enter his lines. Burnside, Buell, Hooker, Thomas Williams, and McClellan himself all warned their soldiers against receiving slaves, and most of them permitted masters to come forward and remove slaves found within the lines. The constant charge.
See, if Horn wants to make the argument of a wildcat, this was more the wildcat strike, which is a only to be realized after 1862, with the Emancipation Proclamation, into a general dynamic. You see what I'm saying?
What is the difference between wildcat and journalist?
A wildcat, first of all, of short duration, usually lesser consequences. A wildcat can last a couple days usually. and smaller numbers. You know, wildcat would be a couple of plantations, let us say in Virginia.
Isn't it more improvised as well?
Like more spontaneous.
You could say more spontaneous. The other thing is the quality of the leadership.
Right.
And when Du Bois makes the claim of a general strike, I don't know whether, I don't remember whether he points there. He's making the point though, that there were potential leaders already. They were free Negroes. They were people who were sold, or rented out, let us say, to work in a city, in a town, on urban stuff. So there were these networks of, as he says, more intelligent people who were the potential leaders of a more general strike. And when he talks about 2,000 people in North Carolina leaving the plantations and then forced back, and this is, by the way, the Union Army was abiding by the Dred Scott decision. When they were driven back, that itself was an experience that raises their consciousness. So they're driven back not to be happy on the plantation, but to prepare for something bigger. This is the drama that he is, and it takes a lot of literary skill to do what he's doing here. And it takes a lot of literary foolishness not to see what he's doing here. But I'll see it.
The constant charge of Southern newspapers, Southern politicians, and their Northern sympathizers that the war was an abolition war met with constant and indignant denial. Loyal newspapers, orators, and preachers, with few exceptions, while advocating stringent measures for putting down the rebellion, carefully disclaimed any intention of disturbing the, quote, peculiar institution of the South.
Now, when the rebellion that he's talking about here is the rebellion of the South against the North.
The Secretary of State informed foreign governments through our ministers abroad that this was not our purpose. President Lincoln, in its earlier messages, substantially reiterated the statement. Leading generals on entering Southern territory issued proclamations to the same effect. One even promised to put down any slave insurrection, quote, with an iron hand, end quote, while others took vigorous measures to send back the fugitives who sought refuge within their lines.
Okay, now these were Union generals saying they will put down any slave insurrection. The Union Army now, okay.
Quote, in the early years of the war, if accounts do not err, during the entire period McClellan had commanded the Army of the Potomac, John Brown's body was a forbidden heir among the regimental bands.
The singing of John Brown's. Mm-hmm.
The Hutchinsons were driven from Union camps for singing abolition songs. And insofar as the Northern Army interested itself at all in the slavery question, it was by the use of force to return to their Southern masters fugitives seeking shelter in the Union lines. While information they possessed, especially respecting the roads and means of communication, should have been of inestimable service to the Federals, they were not to be employed as laborers or armed as soldiers. The North avoided the appearance of a desire to raise Negroes from the plane of chattels to the rank of human beings, end quote.
By the way, the Hutchinsons, you know, you've heard of the women's group called the Emotions. The name is Hutchinson.
Oh.
So I just want to bring that up.
What do you mean the name is Hutchinson? What do you mean the name is
That's their last name, the Hutchinson sisters. The Emotions. Behold. Don't ask my neighbor, you know.
Here was no bid for the cooperation of either slaves or free Negroes. In the North, Negroes were not allowed to enlist and often refused with indignation. Quote, the weakness of the South temporarily became her strength. Her servile population, repulsed by Northern pro-slavery sentiment, remained at home engaged in agriculture thus releasing her entire white population for active service in the field, while on the other hand, the military resources of the North were necessarily diminished by the demands of labor, end quote. It was as Frederick Douglass said in Boston in 1865 that the Civil War was begun, quote, in the interest of slavery on both sides. The South was fighting to take slavery out of the Union, and the North was fighting to keep it in the Union. The South fighting to get it beyond the limits of the United States Constitution, and the North fighting for the old guarantees, both despising the Negro, both insulting the Negro, end quote.
Everybody did what Frederick Douglass was saying.
Yeah.
So therefore, the North and the South could never resolve the contradiction of the war. It would take the Negro.
That's deep.
Deep indeed.
It was therefore at first by no means clear to most of the 4 million Negroes in slavery what this war might mean to them. They crouched consciously and moved silently, listening, hoping, and hesitating.
Just crouched consciously. Isn't that interesting? Crouched consciously. It's almost like a contradiction.
Why do you say that?
I don't know. I mean, it's just, it's interesting. The position of the Negro, especially at this point where both sides were fighting to preserve slavery, where the contradiction between them had not reached the point of an existential either or thing, where the Negro could decide at all. Okay, maybe it's
No,
not.
but why does it have to reach an existential point to have a conscious, one decision being made?
This is interesting. I think, now here's my own interpretation. It's like he says the whole thing, and move silently, listening. See, the thing is moving silently. I'm whispering to her. I'm not letting any side know what I'm thinking, and I'm acting like, oh, I'm still just happy on the plantation type of thing.
That's so interesting.
And then he adds, hoping and hesitating.
Yeah.
We put all of those, it's a beautiful painting. Oh God, I'm sorry.
And what I've been noticing throughout us reading
A painting that hasn't yet been painted. But go ahead.
I
I'm sorry.
already got you on that.
Okay.
But as we've been reading the beginning of this chapter, I've been noticing how Du Bois hints at these developments of things.
Yes.
Not very in quantitative, but just in different qualitative, literary.
Yeah.
You got it exactly right. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Well, it actually reminds me of Baldwin's literature too, because I remember even when I was in undergrad and analyzing some of Baldwin's novels, one of the common devices he uses is this quality of people watching, especially black folk, both watching each other, but looking and watching at society as a whole.
Yeah.
And that's something he'll say oh, this person was watching this person, this person was watching this unfold. And I think that it's part of you even can trace it from this, but it's also part of what Baldwin's assertion, which is that Black people know white people better than white people know themselves. And it's even when you don't have the ability to write, the ability to read, still there's the quality of what the white planter had never estimated, which was Black people's even ability to watch what was happening.
That brings up a point. I was talking to Sade about this in the car when she dropped me off at work last week, because I was thinking about how we were talking about how white people don't or want to use their history.
Yeah.
And it's a similar point that you're making about watching. When you look at something or a situation or a person, you're like, I wouldn't do that. Or there's a situation that unfolds and you're like, this is crazy. And you learn something from it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that's why it's interesting what you say about, how could they crouch consciously. Because it's just like,
So
okay, yes, their
interesting.
position might be bad or not advantageous, but it's at a particular point. It's at the particularity of their position is actually their interest in what they can or what Black people could do or use anyway. But yeah.
But this is very interesting. And, first of all, their consciousness was intact. They were conscious.
Yeah.
But this idea of watching,
Yeah.
and it is like Jerry said, it's in Baldwin, it is a feature of Black behavior, this watching. I know myself, I get impatient. Why don't we do something? Can't we see that Obama ain't worth shit? Can't we see that Biden is a fraud? You know what I'm saying? You want something of me. Objectively, you would say we should be in rage and in an uproar. But see this thing, and Du Bois captured it, watching, waiting, as
But also,
moving silently, listening, hoping, and hesitating. And let me just say this. I mean, first of all of this together, first, why did he put hesitating last? Move silently, listening, hoping, and hesitating. You see what I'm saying? It's first, let me just say this. First of all, from a it's very poetic. That's what a poet would do it. You know what I'm saying? But okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sarah. I'm sorry.
I'm only bursting because it's like, okay, because it's this whole thing about the dynamics of the proletariat, or like if you want to talk about it in this way, and why is it that the boys can make us see the human in everything?
Yeah, right. Interesting. That's right.
But that's also a part of how
to see the human.
Yeah, how part that Black Reconstruction is a work of philosophy because it develops a certain way to tell a story.
This
There's a certain way to because when I'm thinking about why is this story being told and how is it working like a story and how can I see it in my mind? But it's also this is a historical. You can argue it. You can argue against it historically. You can say like maybe there's some facts that are wrong and so we can dismiss it. Or you can argue against it maybe like solely in ideological or practical Marxist terms. But that's not exactly it either. As in like you can't exactly argue against it because that's not even what it is anyway.
One thing you can't do, you can't accuse it of exaggeration.
No.
It is not an exaggeration. It is a balanced look. And I'm sorry.
You can't bind it down.
You
can't go after
it.
You can't only limit it to like and to a Marxist term or whatever, because that's not what because okay, if I read
that's very important.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, like just on that point, why can't you?
Exactly.
Why couldn't he just do a Marxist analysis? Well, because Marxism has never had to deal with this type of existential situation.
Yeah, because it's about the human development, human march
Absolutely.
towards freedom.
Absolutely.
Me,
Absolutely.
you, anybody striving towards freedom.
Yes.
That's what he's talking
and
about.
This is
defending humanity. That's what he's talking about.
That's right. That's right.
And so what is the human?
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm saying like what is the human?
Because see,
yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Who has ever had to write in this way about a group whose humanity
Right.
was widely attacked.
And that's the essential.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the essential
yes.
quality to how America could even reach a democracy is if the majority of people, the people in this country are actually human instead of property or just workers as such. You know what I mean?
I understand completely what you're saying, and I would say, in building on what you're saying, the very thing that 20th century existential philosophers were trying to achieve in their philosophy, i.e., the centralization of human freedom, frankly, in the abstract, could not be realized philosophically because there was no connection to the concrete historical, which Du Bois does, and hence makes a perfect existential argument in ways that existential philosophers never fucking could. Because there is, to deal with as you say, to make a humanistic argument that is not an abstract universal, you have to deal with a concrete that is not human. Does that mean, I don't know whether, in other words, Du Bois is making an argument, an existential argument for humanity by looking at a group who were not seen as human and were treated as though they were not human.
Yeah, my mind is on another point.
Okay, go ahead. No, I finished what I was saying.
No, because I'm really thinking about the trialectic, like what? No, I'm sorry.
No, but that's,
but because it's interesting to me.
That's a lot.
I guess because it's like dialectics have to do with like two things happening at the same time.
Right.
Really.
Right. The unity of opposites.
Yeah, the unity of opposites. And how you kind of need both to come to a conclusion. But it's interesting because the thing is that
this is why you need the concrete, because you're absolutely right. There are situations where a dialectic unity of opposites is perfect for, fits perfectly.
Yeah.
But if you could, I don't see how you could make the argument here using twos. There has to be threes, at least, but certainly three. And I say this then forces the philosopher, in this case, Du Bois, the logician, to argue from the empirical, the actual, rather than the abstract.
Of course, yeah.
And in making, and then in making that argument, the logical argument, that it has to be more than twos, he also has to argue that it is that because the critical side, the strategic side, the African, has been dehumanized. So then you have to fold into a logical argument an existential argument. And you have to make, you can't make a logical argument without the existential argument, nor in this Du Boisian sense can you make the existential argument without the logical, which I would call the logical historical argument. And
but not to be too in the air, but I do think that in this,
I need your help, Danny. Wake up, brother. We need to hear you, man. You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
You sure? Yeah. Okay.
But what's interesting though is that throughout this entire text of Black Reconstruction, he's constantly saying something about the now. He's always well, there's a precedent to this. There's an example of the planter class. It it disappeared, which says things about society or the way that things could go for the reader, say me, today, you know? Meaning like, oh, I can look at the ruling class and I can be like, oh, you guys aren't here forever, for instance.
That's
But
a
even
very strong point.
even because, okay, it's interesting to me last couple of weeks that you mentioned that Gerald Horn or somebody mentioned the propaganda of history as being like the most important chapter.
No, Henry Louis Gates.
Henry Louis Gates, and I was like, well, you kind of have to get to that chapter
You have to get
first.
to that
You can't just like jump to the chapter.
Right.
But also,
Right.
that means that Du Bois is coming to a head with the propaganda of history, or with that chapter at the end. He's saying something, but you know, similar to how he is writing his chapter and how we're seeing it unfold, or like seeing how the story unfolds in this particular chapter here, which is also involved in like 10 other chapters of this book.
You're absolutely right. Yes, as a complete intellectual work.
Right.
A complete work intellectually. You know, this, and now I'm thinking so much about Nuri, you know, I curse, she doesn't, but then to see such a complete work, such a magnificent intellectual work be reduced in the ways that it has been. I would, it is also, besides being a complete intellectual work, I would even call it a complete work of art.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely so.
Because the poetry of it, the literary dimensions of it,
But anyway, just the thing about the threes, I
in the
think
Richard Wagnerian sense of a complete work of art.
yeah. Wait, Wagner, like the German,
The opera.
Yeah, the opera, he considered opera a complete work of art.
Nice. But no, but yeah, just in terms of threes, I just think that
Shit is deeper than deep.
maybe this is too much, but I would say that like time is definitely important. That's what I meant by like.
So that time is definitely important.
Yeah, just
explain what you mean.
That's what I meant by the now is because it's like abstract and concrete, but then there's there's like another dimension to it.
Keep going. What
like
is
the
that?
forward dimension of what does both mean, the past and the present. You know, what is being studied and what is to come. But like what I'm saying is like, okay, there is the present concrete, and then there's the historical, and you know how you get there. But then there's also what you know what I mean? Like there's gonna be a future from that particular present. So that's why I think that there's threes. But
Go ahead, man.
I think just
have mercy.
Building on this,
on me, man.
Like I feel like I'm just starting to understand what it means to view this as a work of philosophy, because I read that I read the analytic philosophy article that you shared from Jacobin, and even even the example of someone like Bertrand Russell, who's like, he starts out with the intent of creating like a new logical philosophical system. But like what Du Bois is doing, it's almost like he starts out with certain assumptions, which is basically like he assumes the humanity of Black people. But it's like through this book, he's like looking for the human, and it's like through that, it's like he's both doing like the inductive but also the deductive thing, where it's like he's moving, it's like he's looking for the human, and then it's like what he finds, it's almost like he's both creating, but also he's trying to make sense of the creation of like almost like a new philosophy through that. Like I don't know, I'm still trying to make sense of it, but
it makes all the sense. Given what Du Bois himself has said, when he was told at Harvard, when William James's closest friend and mentor at Harvard said, well, don't go into philosophy because you can't make a living with it. Du Bois said, I decided then to unite philosophy and history to produce sociology.
He called it a science of human action.
Yeah, and called sociology the science of human action, not the science of human misery, by the way. You know?
But action.
But this linking of philosophy and history.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Mhm. So he's always interested in philosophy. You know, he's never, you mentioned Bertrand Russell, he abhorred Anglo-American philosophy in its pragmatist form or in its analytic form, always, and always preferred German philosophy. In other words, Hegel and Kant and such.
Yeah.
And you see it. You see it.
Yeah, because it's almost like the humanistic part of it, it's almost like even like this whole dynamic of the triad or the trialectics, it's almost like he's saying like that human like the course of human history, but also just the capacity of human beings, it creates like new possibilities even in terms of logic. Like it creates like new I mean, I feel like you've been saying this the whole time, but it's like
That's true.
up until like it's almost like he's saying like, it's like
Sorry.
up until now
Yes.
like up until now maybe like this kind of like a new kind of dialectic involving like these
Right.
three
This is
actors
interesting.
like was not possible, but
This
that
is interesting.
these but like people like the actions of human beings make the possibility of even like new
Can I
logic.
just say something? You know who, and I don't say it's made completely. Jean-Paul Sartre makes a similar argument in his work, A Critique of Dialectical Reasoning. And he makes the argument, first of all, he denies Engel's idea of a dialectic of nature. But, and if I read him right, I don't know that I am, it seems that Sartre is making something close to the point that you're making, that the historical logics, social logics are not just in place, and we use dialectical reasoning to understand society, but human beings are creating logics. You know,
So,
just as you said it.
Wait, it's so like
Let me just go to the bathroom.
it's very it's very similar to like this. Okay, like I don't know if this is like a superficial argument, but it is very similar to like the whole Juche thing. Like the North Korean Juche idea, which is like basically asserting that like it assumes like the whole Marxism Leninism thing, but it also posits that like in a very basic way, but it's like man is like the deciding factor of like everything. And like I don't know, it's like a very like basic formulation in some ways, but in a deeper way, it's kind of like what Du Bois is saying. I feel like I don't know. It's a hypothesis. Like
Man-centered philosophy.
Right.
Wait, but how does it contrast the law and chance?
But like, I feel like it's I don't know. I just thought of it because it's
You know you gotta have to repeat it.
like it feels similar to what Du Bois
Okay.
is doing, which is or like even what Doc was saying, which is that it's like not that there aren't social laws and social patterns which need to be understood and worked with and but it also is suggesting that ultimately like what is the creative force of like almost like new like new logics, like new philosophy is like the human being, I guess, which is I mean it basically we're also trying to make sense of like how was the North able to like withstand like basically 70 years of constant pressure from US imperialism. And like part of it is I don't know, part of it does feel kind of similar to Mao in some ways, but it's almost like because the North Koreans were like, oh, we can do it. It's like they brought into existence something just almost like through like human like sheer belief in the ability of the human being. Like they brought into existence something that like was hitherto thought as impossible, basically. But yeah, I was just trying to make sense of like how Du Bois like could be seen as in conversation with like the whole like North Korean philosophy of Juche and all that stuff.
Mhm.
I also feel like just being able to comprehend the laws of nature and our boundaries excuse me, presents itself a potential that really only exists in human beings as far as we can understand. You know what I mean? Like nothing else can really see in that grand scale and understand its own limitations in that way, because understanding it allows you to work in a different way with it.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important that we're studying the logics of American history, like revolutionary process. But that's not to say like it's a predetermined thing or like it's actually to increase the capacity of the or the potential for revolutionary
Time.
Yeah, that's now just to give an example of what you were saying.
Yeah. No, that's fine.
This is so. I'm sorry I had to go to the bathroom, but see, this is the Sartrean argument. See, if you see, you can end up in a teleological argument, which then takes human action out of human existence. What's already determined. Dialectical logic tells us so. You see, that's most of what goes for Marxism and radical thought today. And hence the inability to grasp what Du Bois is doing, which is right in front of our eyes. And it's a Sartre, because Sartre, and if I understand the work properly, he is making the argument that if you go with laws rather than laws and human action, law and chance, to use Du Bois's formulation, humanity and human action is taken out of the equation. Don't forget, he's talking about philosophy and history. He says to produce sociology, but that was in the late 1890s, early 1900s. He says that it is possible. And here I got to look at that chapter, Empire and Science in Dusk of Dawn, which really helps us to understand how he is thinking philosophically, the broad boundaries of his philosophical thinking. But he already, and I use this is sociological word, might not be the word. He operationalizes an existentialism and makes it indispensable to a logic. He's saying a logic, but he's not bound to it dogmatically because he sees the human, that is the existential. So when he talks about the Negro crouching consciously, because you have all of these images then and now of Black people in a crouch state or in a little happy coon state, all of these stereotypes, but not conscious. All of the stereotypes fortify the concept that Black people are not capable of a high level of consciousness or intellect. Was he saying the whole fucking opposite? By the way, AJ, we just read where he quotes Frederick Douglass in the text here. So that's from a philosophical standpoint, it is one of the most liberating things you can imagine. And it should be studied in departments of philosophy. Easily, fucking easily. It fits. I mean, if you're about philosophy, it fits so well. But and then, here we go back to the Lenin-Du Bois synthesis. It fits the way Lenin conceives of doing philosophy. That is, philosophy is ideology by other means. That's what the propaganda of history is about. What he is saying, history is ideology by other means. Lenin, I don't know that Lenin ever said this, I just gathered this from my interpretation. By the way, in his book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, which is not this, throwaway, it's a great work. In that, he establishes a method of critiquing and understanding philosophy. That's what Du Bois does at the end of Black Reconstruction. Don't look at his, because see, let me just say, his PhD advisor was a guy, William Bushnell Hart, a historian. Du Bois wanted to do philosophy, couldn't do it. There was no thing as such as sociology, so he does his PhD in history. And William Bushnell Hart was his dissertation advisor. And he would say of William Bushnell Hart, saying that, by not saying it openly or rudely, that William Bushnell Hart did history in a way that he, Du Bois, did not want to do it. In other words, William Bushnell Hart, if he went into his office, he'd have files up to the ceiling with facts. So any fact you wanted to know, he said, well, go to that file over there and pull out the second drawer, and you will see a file on X, Y, and Z. He had all the facts in the world, but no knowledge, or very little knowledge. You see what I'm saying? That's why Du Bois says that philosophy and history, probably learned that in Germany too.
Yes.
But then the outcome of the fusion, of the synthesis of the two, is something very different. And that's what I want to work out. And but you see what he's doing, and we could see it here. And Du Bois was always a sociologist, so he's always dealing. See, no social science, no sociologist can deal with the whole population. 4 million Black people enslaved in the South. Ain't no way in the world, even under the best conditions, that you would know or could study each of those people or the whole collective. So you take a sample of them. That's why you hear in survey research and sociology, a representative sample. Now, the representative is a fiction, I think, most of the time. Nobody can do, what is a represent? How do you know it's representative? You know what I'm saying? But that's another question. But what Du Bois deals with are samples, discrete groups that reflect something larger. So that's the sociological being used to support a historical analysis, and of course, vice versa. But then you also have to have the philosophical tools to fucking know how to do it, to know how to think, to know what a category of knowledge is. You got to know that. And that's why, so much of now it's becoming even laughable. All of this talk about Black Reconstruction, they're talking about something else. It's not this.
No.
You see what I'm saying?
It's not.
It ain't. So what the hell are you talking about? That's what. And I think I'm like you. It's a hard work to criticize because it is complete. I mean, you have to find a way to critique, and it should be critiqued, I guess. But if you're going to do it, you got to know what it is and what is being done, and you have to acknowledge. And I've never seen anybody even come close to say it is a complete intellectual work. Never acknowledge, because how could a Black man produce a complete intellectual work? Even the great Du Bois is still a Black man.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? And that's always in the conscious and unconscious mix. You see what I'm saying? A Black man wrote this, and it's entitled Black Reconstruction. Take Foner. A white man wrote it, and it's called Reconstruction.
White Reconstruction.
No, he didn't call it. But the assumption is, although it's not what he says he's doing, he says that the Blacks are central to it. You know what I'm saying? To Reconstruction. Well, but you can't lose sight. You know, every sociology of knowledge is based upon the social conditions out of which knowledge is produced, right? So a Black man writes Black Reconstruction, a white man writes Reconstruction. Now, okay, Reconstruction is celebrated, Black Reconstruction is out of publication until recently. I mean, the dynamic, what Derek called unusual dynamics. But so when Black Reconstruction is being reappropriated or received in a new situation after, quote, Black Lives Matter. So you have Black Lives Matter, now we can have Black Reconstruction, at least we can discuss it. But the assumption is that Reconstruction gives you the factual history to help you critique Black Reconstruction. At the end of the day, you're privileging the white thinker over the Black thinker. Although the white thinker, Foner, has to acknowledge, I think, partially, that his work is a limited work, but Du Bois, but he doesn't say this, Du Bois's work is a complete work. Maybe we have comments of people.
No, not really. Virginia Cott says why poor whites settled in Appalachia. I don't know.
I think she's referring to like the free soil movement.
Oh.
Say that again.
In reference to the free soil movement, Virginia.
Yes. Well, the poor whites come out of small farmers mainly, who were driven off their land by the plantation owners, and they were driven into the hills. That's why they're called hillbillies. And rednecks because they had to work in conditions similar to sharecropping. So redneck, that means they were always looking, and their necks were sunburnt, you know?
And then Wayne Curtis says, can't listen today, having an art showing, but we'll come back to it.
Oh,
All
yeah.
power to the people.
Yeah, thank you, man.
That's it.
Okay. Woo! I think maybe we should chill at this point.
Yeah, we should
Okay,
chill.
sure, we can
We should
chill.
chill.
Yeah, this is damn.
Page
61.
You can also.
Yeah, that was
You're very-
cool.
Page 61.
That was fun.
Yeah, oh,
Yeah.
definitely.
It's great when we get to read.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting because when I was talking to my dad about, it was the first time I think my dad heard the formulation of America's multiple revolutions. And my parents have always really been interested in the American Revolution for some reason. And I think maybe it's because they landed in Boston.
Yeah, true.
But when I described the second American Revolution, the Civil War, Reconstruction, I described it as a movement. I told him, I was like, you know how people usually see it as North versus South, but really the war was won by a movement of Black people who decided, who in the face of an aristocratic class that fell down, it was the formerly enslaved, it was the Black slaves who made the mass move to decide that they were done with the status quo and made the decisive move for a new society or something new. And it was interesting because my dad, at that point, I feel like usually when I talk to my parents, I'll try to ahead of time think of how I'll tell them certain things. But this time I was just like blah 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 blah. And my dad was like, that was so, I could tell he was like, that was so interesting. Because this was me talking about movement, like revolution in America being about movements. Because then I was like, think about the civil rights movement, where it's the civil rights movement is a movement of people who've decided that like they are done with the status quo and are ready to assert a new society, assert, you know, that they become prepared, conscious, like they're prepared to govern. Like essentially it's like what Diane Nash said, where it's like you become so big that you're no longer able to be segregated. And my dad, and so I was like, so now that's what I'm stressed about now is like, how would you decide, like, how do you theorize this for the next American Revolution as like a movement? And my dad was like, I can hear when he's listening to me intently because he makes these certain sounds like, and then he was like, wow, like I could tell he was like, whoa, I've never thought about it as a movement of people. And this is the decisive chapter of Black Reconstruction, the general strike. Because the other interesting thing is like people really dismiss King and they dismiss the Montgomery bus boycott oftentimes because they don't see it as a general strike. Because it's not one single union or one single industry of workers going on strike. But what does it mean that, like, to say basically the class struggle, the class conflict is political? So here in Montgomery, you have working class people, workers, like Black people who are deciding, like, I'm refusing to cooperate with this system. And so that's I don't know, that's kind of interesting.
That's a very interesting point. And when you're talking to your dad, are y'all speaking in Chinese?
No, English.
Yeah, I was just interested because I think, I don't know, for me, because, you know, speaking in Chinese would anchor somehow the discussion as well in the Chinese Revolution.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know that it would. I'm just culturally, it would be very interesting to me. But you know, you can tell your dad this is as breathtaking for us as it is for him.
Yeah, it is.
This is,
Yeah, well, my dad seemed a little hesitant when I was talking about revolution because he was like, are you saying that we need to take state power in the US? But I was trying to tell him, well, this is the interesting thing because people assess the civil rights movement as a failure because we didn't take state power. And if anything, King, like people think that King convinced Black people to go into the Democratic Party. But I think that's an inaccurate assessment.
That's totally wrong.
Yeah, and it's also a negation.
The opposite of.
Yes, and it's also a negation of like basically the power of the people, like
Right.
and the agency of all the people who are being transformed in the process and we're becoming prepared to govern a new society and determine a new society. Like kind of what Jeremiah was saying about bending, forcing a bend.
Yeah, bending.
And yeah, it's interesting because like when you were talking earlier, Doc, like in America, like we have already this thing about how you're distinguishing that we don't have an aristocracy in the US anymore. If anything, okay, sure, you could say the closest was the Southern planter class that was still trying to emulate Britain, which Du Bois goes into in the second chapter, the third chapter, the white planter. But if anything, I feel like you could say it's like 1776, like we already, like we've freed ourselves from an aristocracy. So it's like what's happening in the cumulative revolutions, American revolutions, the second and the third, it's not about getting rid of an aristocracy. We're already like that's been achieved. It's your idea of revolution has to become different. Like because in China, it's like China, the whole civil war, the revolution is to seize power. Like it's basically about seizing power after like an aristocracy or whatever you want to call it, the dynasty.
The Qing
dynasty. The Qing dynasty.
And that's why you had a civil war between KMT and the communists over power,
right,
over the state. And that's why it made it so easy for the Japanese to invade. But there was no state.
That's also why the Cultural Revolution is so wrong. Because it's a mistake. You're not looking to, there is no aristocracy left to defeat. It's not like you're trying to smash another state. Like it's like so I don't know. I guess that's
That's
just
a great.
about it.
Go
That
ahead,
is a
tease
good
it on
point.
out,
It is a
Emily.
good
This is
point.
very significant. I feel.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
actually
maybe we
moving
can tease it
backwards
later.
instead of going forward.
Yes, then you're just trapping yourself in like a dishwasher revolution going towards nowhere, rather than actually being able to. Because actually, if anything, China would need something similar to these stages of revolution to achieve a certain substance of democracy, like a new
Yeah.
democracy, a state of the whole people. I don't know.
Yeah, because it makes sense why you in the descriptions of Mao, maybe if I'm remembering correctly, how it became more about himself rather than
Well, it did. In his concept of world revolution,
right
he felt.
instead of the
He
state
felt-
of the whole
yeah.
people and those kind of things.
Yeah. I'm sorry about that.
No.
He felt that the Cultural Revolution could be the first stage towards a world revolution.
Right.
And like
Yeah,
just
and that the
that could be the catalyst for
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's an interesting article that I read recently from Compact magazine by this guy who's based in Sweden. His name is Malcolm Kayun, but he talks about how America's present day reputation as a quote unquote conservative country by default is actually it goes counter to basically the entirety of American history when Europe looked to America as like the revolutionary country in all respects. And it was only with the Cold War that you saw an attempt to completely transform that into what America is like now known as, which is like a conservative country compared to Europe, right?
Interesting.
And that the civil rights movement was the attempt to basically reclaim America and reassert America as a country which is like a revolutionary country
That's
again.
right. That's right. That's right. I'm
yeah.
sorry. Keep
No.
talking.
That was
See, we always, and I was a part of this, associated post-World War II Europe, the Europe of large communist parties, Europe of a welfare state, of socialist in government and all that type of thing, as representative or manifestation of a revolutionary progressive Europe, and the fact that there was neither a huge communist party, but a communist party that was under attack. There was no socialist movement like Europe, and there was only a relatively small welfare state as compared to Europe. So Europe, but it was not the case. I agree with him that, in fact, I've heard argued that the European working class, as a result of depression and war and compromises with the ruling class, has been exhausted. And the great revolutionary potential among developed capitalist countries, and maybe among countries and a lot of countries in general in the world, the great revolutionary potential is here. And I agree with that, and this is why King must be seen as a revolutionary. He triggers, he stokes, he represents a new revolutionary energy rooted in the previous revolutions of America. And how could you see it? And I mean, when you get right down to it, I sound like the Delphonics.
I knew you were going to say that.
When you get right down to it, there is still a lot of revolutionary potential among the American people.
Definitely.
Would you say?
Well, because I feel like it gets back to this thing that Du Bois was also saying, and also you were bringing up how Baldwin says about watching and waiting. Because I remember the first time I read Black Reconstruction, that also really stuck out to me. How, like, what makes a people, and then what do a people give who are capable of like watching and waiting? Basically, well, like we talked about, basically being able to push, not concede to just the North or the South, but to drive like the third part of a new triad. No, I think there's a lot of potential.
And this, just because people are waiting doesn't mean they're not watching and they're not conscious.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
I know I get that wrong all the time. That waiting is a lack of courage or lack of
Mhm.
forthrightness or lack of consciousness. And Du Bois, that's why that sentence is so, I'm going to read it a lot today.
Well, also how he said they weren't just going to join anything. Like they weren't just
Yes.
going to join any army. It had to be an army of freedom.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, I mean that's why it's like through even like the first like 3 pages of the chapter, Du Bois keeps saying the Union Army did not want to be an army of emancipation, but that it was the black worker that bent it towards
Your
being an
formula,
army
yes.
of emancipation.
Yes.
And I think that also, like the Diane Nash quote had also been in my mind too, because in a lot of ways it is similar to how the civil rights movement conceived of itself. It's like we're going to force the nation to revolve around us rather than just being the objects of like American society. And I think that it's almost, you can also like use that analogy to even think about Du Bois. Like Du Bois's way of thinking, like it's almost like I feel like the way that we're trying to put it forward, like everything will bend, everything bends towards that.
It's like double consciousness or even the veil. Like Du Bois is talking from the veil. Like he's writing with he's basically writing with the double
The
consciousness.
same thing with Baldwin. You still have to deal. You still have to deal with the black.
Well, he would call it double vision at that
Okay,
point.
sorry.
But that's okay. No, I think he, even in Souls, if you don't mind, there's a difference between double consciousness and double vision. You know, first of all, the assertion of consciousness for the black people, former slave, is a revolutionary idea when he writes it, even to a certain extent now. But double vision seems to me, and he doesn't return to these things at all in his work in that form, although it seems to have been infused into all of this. But double vision is seeing and knowing. Double consciousness often is seeing oneself through the lens of your other. That is the white world. Black people seeing themselves through the way white people see them, or behaving in ways that white people would want them to behave. We see that all the time among black people. It becomes very frustrating sometimes, especially in popular culture and sports and so on, you know, boxing. Yeah, but anyway, we'll get to that another time. But double vision is double knowing both sides. That's the way I would say it, yeah. However, as you said, the veil, which is a metaphor for a separation, but also for the fact that the white world does not see you. You know, but the seeing and knowing is the vision, I think, part of it. You know, yeah, that's and all of it is really, I mean, if anybody wanted to be an existential philosopher, Du Bois could be, you know, the foundation of your existentialism, more than Heidegger or Sartre, who I consider the 2 greatest existentialists, European existentialists, the greatest. I don't think, and Heidegger is much more difficult for me to read and so on, but I don't think they got what Du Bois got, because there is not the historical concrete in their thinking. Well, it's 2 o'clock. I guess we have to shut it down. I think we're gonna have to do a Sun Ra thing. You know, Sun Ra, all his whole orchestra lived in one house, like a monastery. Yes.
I looked up the definition of existential, and it says it's concerned with existence, especially human existence, as viewed in phase of existential.
Read it as what?
The definition is weird. Concerned with existence, especially human existence.
Yes. And one of the fundamental tropes of existential philosophy is situation, the human situation. And you'll hear it today, appropriated in all kinds of ways. Situational logics, situation, as a way of talking completely relativistically. By the way, Du Bois philosophically is not a relativist. So he doesn't think in this is my truth and you can have your truth. He believes that there is such a thing as the truth.
Okay.
Eat, man. Let